Tonight, you're going to hear the entire history of medieval England, every major event, every important king, every battle that shaped the nation. We start in 450 AD when the Romans left Britain empty and vulnerable. We end in 1485 when the last medieval king died at Bosworth Field. That's over 1,000 years of history. You'll learn about Saxon kingdoms rising from ruins, Viking invasions that nearly destroyed England, the Norman conquest that changed everything, the birth of Parliament, the Black Death, the Wars of the Roses. This is the complete story of how England became England. Before we begin, hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoy these long-form history videos. I'm also curious, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. When the Romans left Britain in 410 AD, they left behind a power vacuum. No central government, no organised army, no unified law. What happened next would determine everything. Would Britain split into tiny warring tribes? Would it be conquered by barbarians? Would Christianity survive? Would learning and literacy disappear forever? The stakes were massive. This wasn't just about who would be king. This was about whether civilization itself would survive in Britain. Saxon warriors were flooding in from Germany. Celtic kingdoms were fighting back. Viking raiders were coming across the North Sea. Each group wanted to control the rich farmland and towns the Romans had left behind. The decisions made during these centuries created the foundation of modern England. Parliament, common law, constitutional monarchy, the English language itself. None of this was guaranteed to happen. Every battle mattered. Every alliance mattered. Every law that was written mattered. Because the England that would eventually rule the seas, create Shakespeare, and spread democracy around the world, that England had to be built first. And building it took 1,000 years of war, politics, and slow change. The story starts now. The year is 410 AD. The last Roman legions are marching away from Britain's shores. For nearly 4 centuries, the Eagle Standards had kept the peace. Roman roads connected every corner of the island. Roman law governed the people. Roman coins filled the markets. Now the Eagles were gone and Britain was on its own. The Roman withdrawal wasn't sudden. It had been building for decades. Barbarian tribes were pressing against Rome's borders across Europe. The empire needed every soldier it could get. Britain, that distant island province, was no longer worth defending. But the Britons who remained had grown dependent on Roman protection. Their own military skills had grown weak. Their leaders were used to taking orders from Roman governors. When those governors left, chaos followed quickly. Within a generation, the carefully maintained Roman world began to collapse. Roads fell into disrepair, towns emptied out, trade networks broke down, coins became scarce. The Latin language started to fade from daily use. Into this power vacuum stepped a British king named Vortigern. He controlled territory in what we now call Wales and Western England. Vortigern faced a serious problem. The Picts from Scotland were raiding his northern borders. The Scots from Ireland were attacking his western coasts. He didn't have enough warriors to fight them all. So Vortigern made a decision that would change British history forever. He decided to hire foreign mercenaries to help him fight. These mercenaries came from across the North Sea. They were Germanic tribesmen from what we now call Germany and Denmark. The Britons called them Saxons, though they actually included Angles, Jutes and other tribes as well. The arrangement seemed simple enough. Vortigern would give the Saxon mercenaries land to settle. In return they would fight his enemies. It was a common practice across the crumbling Roman Empire. Barbarian foederati, allied troops, were being used everywhere to fill gaps in imperial defence. But Vortigern had underestimated what he was dealing with. The first Saxon leaders to arrive were 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa. These names mean stallion and horse in Anglo-Saxon. That might be their real names, or they might be legendary titles that grew in the telling. The early sources about this period mix history with myth in ways that are hard to separate. What we know for certain is this: the Saxon mercenaries didn't stay mercenaries for long. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Hengist and Horsa landed in Kent around 449 AD. Vortigern welcomed them and gave them the Isle of Thanet as payment for their military service. They fought successfully against the Picts and Scots, so successfully that Vortigern invited more Saxons to come. That was his fatal mistake. The new Saxon arrivals looked around and liked what they saw. Britain was fertile and rich. The native Britons were disorganized and weak. Roman civilization was crumbling, but the infrastructure was still there for the taking. Why work as mercenaries when you could simply take over? By 455 AD, the Saxons had turned against their British employers. Horsa died in battle against Vortigern's forces, but Hengist survived and established the first Saxon kingdom in Kent. Other Saxon bands were arriving along the eastern coasts. They found a land ripe for conquest. The British resistance was fierce but uncoordinated. Without Roman organisation, the various British kingdoms couldn't work together effectively. They had forgotten how to fight major wars. Their weapons and tactics were outdated. Most importantly, they were fighting on multiple fronts, against Saxons from the east, Picts from the north, and Scots from the west. This is where the legend of Arthur enters our story. Somewhere in the chaos of late 5th and early 6th century Britain, a British war leader emerged who could actually beat the Saxons in battle. Later Welsh sources call him Arthur. Medieval writers turned him into the greatest king who ever lived. But what do we actually know about the historical Arthur? The honest answer is very little. The earliest mention of Arthur appears in the Welsh poem The Gododin, written around 600 AD. It mentions a warrior who was no Arthur, suggesting Arthur was already famous as the standard for military excellence. The next mention comes from the 9th century History of the Britons by Nennius. This text claims Arthur won 12 battles against the Saxons, culminating in a great victory at Baden Hill. Archaeological evidence from this period is limited but suggestive. Excavations at South Cadbury Hill Fort in Somerset show it was refortified around 500 AD by someone with considerable resources. The site matches later descriptions of Camelot. Similar refortification projects appear at other hill forts across western Britain. What probably happened is this. A British war leader, possibly named Arthur, managed to unite several kingdoms against the Saxon threat. He used traditional British and Roman military tactics, cavalry charges, disciplined infantry, hilltop fortifications against Saxon foot soldiers. For a generation or so he stopped the Saxon advance. The Battle of Baden Hill, probably fought around 500 AD, seems to have been a genuine British victory. After Baden, Saxon expansion stopped for about 50 years. Archaeological evidence shows no new Saxon settlements were established in western areas during this period. But Arthur's victories only bought time. They didn't solve the fundamental problem. The Saxons were still arriving. More importantly, they were already established in much of eastern England. They had better iron weapons than the Britons. They had more experience with warfare. And they were desperate. They had burned their boats behind them when they left Germany. The Britons, meanwhile, were fighting to preserve a Roman way of life that was already dying. Their cities were shrinking. Their trade networks had collapsed. Their population was declining, possibly due to plague that swept through the former Roman provinces in the 6th century. When Arthur died, probably around 530 AD, British resistance crumbled quickly. The Saxon advance resumed with devastating effectiveness. By 550 AD, they controlled most of what we now call England. British kingdoms survived only in the mountains of Wales, the hills of Cornwall, and the lowlands of Strathclyde in southern Scotland. But something interesting was happening in the conquered territories. The Saxons weren't just destroying Romano-British civilization, they were transforming it. Archaeological evidence shows that Saxon settlements often appeared near old Roman sites. They used Roman roads for trade and communication. They adopted some Roman agricultural techniques. Most importantly, they gradually absorbed many of the native British people into their own society. The transformation wasn't always violent. In many areas, it seems to have been surprisingly peaceful. Saxon warrior elites took control of British estates. They married British women. Their children grew up speaking Saxon but learning about the landscape from British mothers and servants. The language shift tells this story clearly. Modern English is fundamentally a Germanic language brought by the Saxons, but it contains hundreds of words borrowed from British Celtic, words for geographical features, animals, plants, and everyday objects. These borrowings show that Saxons and Britons lived together for generations. Place names provide even more evidence. River names like Thames, Avon, and Severn are Celtic, not Saxon. So are many hill and forest names. The Saxons kept the British names for natural features because British guides and workers taught them the landscape. What emerged by 600 AD was something new: Anglo-Saxon England. Not purely Germanic, not purely British, but a fusion of both traditions. The material culture shows this fusion clearly. Excavations at Saxon sites reveal British pottery techniques continuing alongside Germanic metalwork. Anglo-Saxon women wore Germanic-style brooches but also Romano-British jewellery. Saxon warriors were buried with Germanic weapons but also Roman coins and Christian symbols. The Sutton Hoo burial, discovered in Suffolk in 1939, perfectly captures this cultural blending. The main burial mound contained a complete Saxon longship filled with treasures. Germanic weapons, jewellery and drinking horns filled the ship. But it also contained Byzantine silver, Coptic bowls and a possible Christian baptismal spoon. This was a Saxon king, but one who drew his wealth from international trade networks. Most importantly, Sutton Hoo shows that Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were becoming sophisticated political entities. The wealth displayed in the burial required organised taxation, tribute collection, and trade management. These weren't barbarian tribes anymore. They were emerging medieval kingdoms. By 600 AD, the transformation was complete. Roman Britain was dead. Anglo-Saxon England was being born. The next 2 centuries would see that newborn England develop into one of the most cultured and powerful regions of early medieval Europe. Anglo-Saxon England in 600 AD was a patchwork of competing kingdoms. Historians call this period the Heptarchy, the rule of 7 kingdoms. But there were actually more than 7. The major powers were Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. Smaller kingdoms like Wychee, Lindsey, and the Magonsate filled the gaps between them. Each kingdom had its own king, its own laws, its own customs. They fought each other constantly. But they also traded, intermarried, and slowly began to think of themselves as one people, the Anglo-Saxons. Northumbria was the first to achieve real dominance. This kingdom stretched from the Humber River to the Scottish borders. It had been formed by the merger of 2 smaller kingdoms, Bernicia in the north and Deira in the south. King Edwin of Northumbria, who ruled from 616 to 633 AD, was powerful enough that other Anglo-Saxon kings acknowledged him as their overlord. The Venerable Bede, writing a century later, said that Edwin's authority was so complete that a woman could walk from sea to sea carrying her newborn child without fear of harm. Edwin also became the first major Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. His conversion came through marriage to Ethelburga, a Christian princess from Kent. She brought a Roman missionary named Paulinus with her to Northumbria. In 627 AD, Paulinus baptized Edwin and thousands of his followers in the River Swale. This mass conversion wasn't just about personal faith, it was about politics and culture. Christianity connected Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the wider European world. Christian kings could correspond with Frankish rulers and the Pope in Rome. They could access Mediterranean trade networks. Most importantly, Christian kingdoms had literate clergy who could help with administration. But Christianity in Britain was complicated. There were actually 2 different versions competing for influence. Roman Christianity had been brought by Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 AD. Pope Gregory the Great had sent Augustine specifically to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Roman Christianity was hierarchical, organised, and connected to continental Europe. Celtic Christianity had survived in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales throughout the Saxon conquest. Celtic Christians had different practices for calculating Easter, different styles of tonsure for monks, and different approaches to church organisation. They were more decentralised, more mystical, and more tied to local traditions. The conflict between these two versions of Christianity came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 1664 AD. King Oswiu of Northumbria had been converted by Celtic missionaries from Iona, but his wife followed Roman practices. This meant that sometimes the king and queen were celebrating Easter on different dates, an embarrassing situation for a royal court. Oswiu called a council at Whitby Abbey to settle the question. Celtic bishops argued for their traditional practices. Roman advocates, led by Bishop Wilfrid, argued for conformity with Rome and the rest of Western Europe. The debate was really about more than Easter dates. It was about whether Anglo-Saxon Christianity would remain isolated and insular or become part of the broader European Christian community. King Oswiu decided for Rome. His reasoning was both practical and theological. He wanted his kingdom to be connected to continental Europe, and he was convinced by Roman arguments about apostolic succession, the claim that the Pope's authority came directly from St. Peter. The Synod of Whitby was a turning point in English history. It tied the English Church to Rome permanently. It brought Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into closer contact with European learning and culture, and it established the principle that England would generally side with Roman rather than Celtic traditions in religious matters. The choice for Roman Christianity had immediate practical benefits. Anglo-Saxon monasteries began receiving books, teachers, and artistic influences from continental Europe. The famous illuminated manuscripts of Anglo-Saxon England, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, show this cultural fusion at work. Northumbria's golden age reached its peak under kings like Aldfrith, 685–704, and during the careers of scholars like the Venerable Bede, 673–735. Bede's monastery at Jarrow became one of the great centres of learning in Western Europe. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, was the first comprehensive history of England. But Northumbrian power didn't last. The kingdom was too far north, too exposed to Scottish raids, and too dependent on agriculture in marginal lands. By 750 AD, leadership among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had shifted south to Mercia. Mercia was perfectly positioned for dominance. It controlled the rich agricultural lands of the Midlands. It had access to both the Western Mountains and the Eastern Plains. Most importantly, it sat at the centre of the road network that connected all the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. King Ethelbald of Mercia, 716–707, was the first to style himself King of Britain. This was an ambitious title that claimed authority over all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Ethelbald had the military power to back up his claims. He dominated the southern kingdoms and forced tribute payments from weaker neighbours. But it was Ethelbald's successor, Offa, 757–796, who truly transformed Mercia into a European power. Offa ruled Mercia for 39 years. His reign was longer than most medieval kings managed, and he used that time to build unprecedented royal authority. Offa controlled territory from the Humber to the English Channel. He issued the first major English silver coinage since Roman times. He corresponded as an equal with Charlemagne, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. Most famously, Offa built the great earthwork known as Offa's Dyke. This massive fortification ran for 150 miles along the border between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. Parts of the dyke were 25 feet high and 60 feet wide. It required the organised labour of thousands of workers over many years. Offa's Dyke wasn't just a military barrier. It was a statement about royal power and territorial control. It showed that Offa could command resources on a scale not seen in Britain since Roman times. It also established the border between England and Wales that still exists today. The dyke marked where English expansion stopped and Welsh independence began. West of the dyke, Celtic kingdoms maintained their own languages, laws and customs. East of the dyke, Anglo-Saxon culture became dominant permanently. Offa's legal innovations were as important as his military achievements. He issued new law codes that applied across all his territories. These laws standardized weights, measures and currency. They established procedures for resolving disputes between people from different kingdoms. They created the foundation for unified English law. Offa also reformed the English Church. He established the Archbishopric of Lichfield to rival Canterbury's authority. This was a direct challenge to the primacy that Canterbury had claimed since Augustine's mission. Although Lichfield's archbishopric didn't survive Offa's death, the attempt shows his ambition to control every aspect of government. The most remarkable thing about Offa was that contemporary European rulers treated him as an equal. Charlemagne negotiated trade agreements with him. The Pope sought his support for missionary work. Byzantine emperors sent him diplomatic gifts. A letter from Charlemagne to Offa, preserved in Frankish archives, discusses arrangements for English and Frankish merchants trading across the English Channel. Charlemagne addresses Offa as brother, the diplomatic language used between equal rulers. This was recognition that Anglo-Saxon England had become a significant European power. Anglo-Saxon culture was flourishing across all the kingdoms by 800 AD. The epic poem Beowulf was probably composed during this period. It tells the story of a Scandinavian hero, but it reflects the values and concerns of Anglo-Saxon aristocratic society: courage in battle, loyalty to one's lord, and the importance of reputation after death. These were the ideals that motivated Anglo-Saxon warriors. Anglo-Saxon art reached new heights during the 8th century. The illuminated manuscripts produced at monasteries like Lindisfarne and Canterbury combined Celtic, Germanic and Mediterranean artistic traditions. The results were books of stunning beauty that amazed continental scholars. Metalwork and jewellery from this period show similar artistic sophistication. The Staffordshire hoard, discovered in 2009, contained hundreds of gold and silver objects from the 7th and 8th centuries. The craftsmanship rivals anything produced elsewhere in Europe at the time. Most importantly, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were developing the institutions that would shape medieval England. The King's Council, or Witan, gave nobles and bishops a voice in important decisions. Shire courts handled local legal disputes. Trade regulations encouraged economic growth. By 800 AD, Anglo-Saxon England was no longer a collection of barbarian tribes. It had become a sophisticated civilization that could hold its own with any power in Europe. The kings wore purple robes and golden crowns. The nobles built stone halls and endowed monasteries. The merchants traded from Ireland to Constantinople. But this golden age was about to be shattered. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian warriors were building longships and sharpening their weapons. The Vikings were coming. The morning of June 8th, 793, AD started like any other on the holy island of Lindisfarne. Monks were preparing for morning prayers. Scribes were copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. The community had grown wealthy and peaceful under the protection of Northumbrian kings. Then the dragon ships appeared on the horizon. The Viking attack on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of the Viking Age in Europe. The monastery at Lindisfarne was the centre of Christianity in the kingdom of Northumbria, and the event sent tremors throughout the Christian world. Never before has such an atrocity been seen, declared the scholar Alcuin in a letter to the Northumbrian king. The devastation was complete. The Vikings killed some monks, enslaved others, and carried off the monastery's treasures. They destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts and sacred objects. Most shocking to medieval minds, they showed no respect for the sanctuary of God's house. This was Europe's first real encounter with Viking warfare. These Norse people from Denmark, Sweden and Norway had begun to voyage by sea from their homelands, commencing an era of raids and violence. The Vikings were independent farmers at home, but raiders and pillagers when they took to the seas. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a systematic campaign that would bring Anglo-Saxon England to the brink of extinction. Viking raids escalated quickly after 793. Every summer, longships appeared along the English coasts. They struck monasteries, trading centres, and royal estates. The Vikings targeted these sites because they held concentrated wealth that could be seized quickly. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had grown prosperous and peaceful during the 8th century. This prosperity made them attractive targets. but their peace had made them militarily weak. Anglo-Saxon armies were designed to fight other Anglo-Saxon armies, not seaborne raiders who could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline. Early Viking raids followed a consistent pattern. The longships would beach on isolated shores. The crews would march inland to their target. They would seize all the portable wealth they could carry. Then they would return to their ships and sail away before local forces could respond. This hit-and-run warfare was devastating but limited. Individual raids might capture a few thousand silver coins or some golden religious objects, but they couldn't conquer entire kingdoms. That changed in 865 AD with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a full-scale invasion force led by the sons of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok. The leaders included Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Uber Ragnarsson. They brought hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia and immediately began systematic conquest. They didn't just raid and leave. They seized territory and held it. They established winter camps. They demanded tribute payments from local rulers. They began settling Viking families on conquered lands. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell like dominoes. East Anglia was overrun in 865-866. King Edmund was captured and killed, later sainted as a martyr. Northumbria fell in 867 when the Vikings captured York. The ancient royal line of Northumbria was extinguished. Mercia collapsed in 874 after years of devastating warfare. By 878 AD, only Wessex remained under Anglo-Saxon rule. The other kingdoms had either been conquered outright or reduced to Viking puppet states. Viking armies controlled everything from the Scottish border to the Thames Valley. This near extinction of Anglo-Saxon England was possible because the Viking Great Army used superior strategy and tactics. They were more mobile than Anglo-Saxon forces. They could strike anywhere along the coast or the river systems. They used horses for rapid movement inland, something traditional Viking raiders hadn't done. Most importantly, the Vikings had unified command while the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought separately. When Mercia was under attack, Wessex didn't send help. When Northumbria fell, the southern kingdoms didn't coordinate their response. The Anglo-Saxons were defeated in detail, one kingdom at a time. Why did Wessex survive when all the other kingdoms fell? Geography was the key factor. Wessex occupied the peninsula of southwest England. It was protected by the English Channel to the south, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, and extensive forests and marshes to the north and east. Vikings could attack Wessex, but they couldn't surround it completely. Wessex also had the advantage of being the last kingdom standing. By the time the Vikings turned their full attention to Wessex, the West Saxons knew exactly what they were facing. They had learned from the defeats of their neighbours. King Alfred of Wessex, who came to the throne in 871, understood that traditional Anglo-Saxon military tactics wouldn't work against the Vikings. He needed to create new forms of warfare and defence. But first, Alfred nearly lost everything. The impact of Viking conquest on daily life was catastrophic. In the conquered kingdoms, the old social order collapsed completely. Anglo-Saxon nobles were killed or fled into exile. Their estates were seized by Viking jarls. Traditional laws and customs were replaced by Scandinavian practices. Monasteries suffered especially severe damage. These institutions had been the centres of learning, culture, and economic life in Anglo-Saxon England. Viking armies systematically destroyed them. Monks were killed or scattered. Libraries were burned. Schools were closed. The disruption to trade was equally severe. The careful economic networks that had connected Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were shattered. Coins became scarce. Markets disappeared. Long-distance commerce ground to a halt. Archaeological evidence shows the scale of this disruption clearly. Excavations at Anglo-Saxon towns like Hawick, Southampton, and Lundenwic, London, show they were largely abandoned during the period of Viking conquest. The sophisticated urban culture of 8th century England simply vanished. But the Vikings weren't just destroyers. In the territories they controlled, they began creating a new society that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements. The area under Viking control became known as the Danelaw. It covered roughly the northern and eastern half of England. Within the Danelaw, Danish law replaced Anglo-Saxon law. Danish customs replaced Anglo-Saxon customs. The Danish language began influencing the local speech. Viking settlement patterns were different from Anglo-Saxon ones. The Vikings established new types of communities. Some were military camps that grew into towns. Others were agricultural settlements where Scandinavian farmers worked the land alongside Anglo-Saxon peasants. The Vikings brought new technologies and practices. They were skilled metalworkers who improved Anglo-Saxon weapon making. They were experienced sailors who enhanced English shipbuilding. They were aggressive traders who reopened commercial connections to Scandinavia and beyond. Most importantly, the Vikings weren't just conquerors. They were settlers who intended to stay permanently. Viking men married Anglo-Saxon women. Their children grew up bilingual. Within a generation, a new Anglo-Scandinavian culture was emerging. This cultural fusion is visible in the archaeological record. Excavations at York, the Viking capital of Jorvik, show a thriving cosmopolitan city. Viking artifacts appear alongside Anglo-Saxon ones. Scandinavian building techniques were adapted to English conditions. New art styles combined Germanic and Celtic influences. Language provides the clearest evidence of cultural blending. Modern English contains hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse, the language the Vikings spoke. Basic vocabulary like sky, knife, husband, and they comes from Viking settlers. Even more remarkably, English borrowed grammatical structures from Norse that fundamentally changed how the language worked. But this cultural fusion was still incomplete in 878 AD. The Vikings controlled most of England, but they hadn't yet created stable institutions. Their kingdoms were held together by military force rather than administrative systems. They were vulnerable to a determined counterattack if anyone could organize effective resistance. That resistance was about to come from the last unconquered Anglo-Saxon kingdom. In the marshes of Somerset, Alfred of Wessex was planning the campaign that would save England. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871 AD at age 22. He inherited a kingdom under siege. 3 of his older brothers had already died fighting the Vikings. The great heathen army was camped at Reading, just 40 miles from the West Saxon capital at Winchester. Alfred's early years as king were a series of disasters. The Vikings defeated him at the Battle of Wilton in 871. They forced him to pay tribute, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls peace money, to get them to withdraw temporarily. But paying tribute only encouraged more Viking demands. In 876, the Viking army returned under a new leader called Guthrum. This time they established a permanent base at Wareham in Dorset. Alfred surrounded them and forced them to swear oaths to leave Wessex. But the Vikings broke their oaths and escaped by sea to establish a new base at Exeter. The pattern was always the same. Alfred would win tactical victories, but the Vikings would escape to fight again. Their mobility gave them a decisive advantage. They could choose when and where to fight. Alfred had to defend everywhere simultaneously. The crisis reached its peak in January 878. Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on Chippenham, where Alfred was holding court. Winter campaigns were almost unknown in medieval warfare. The Vikings caught the West Saxons completely off guard. Alfred barely escaped with his life. Most of his army scattered. His nobles fled to their estates or submitted to Viking rule. The royal treasury was captured. For the first time since the Viking invasions began, Wessex seemed doomed. Alfred retreated to the Somerset marshes with just a handful of loyal followers. He established a base at Athelney, a small island surrounded by swamps and rivers. From this refuge, he began planning his comeback. The story of Alfred hiding in the marshes became legendary. Later writers claimed he disguised himself as a peasant and was scolded by a farmer's wife for letting her cakes burn. Whether this story is true or not, Alfred's time at Athelney was the lowest point in Anglo-Saxon history. But Alfred used his exile wisely. he sent secret messages to nobles throughout Wessex. He promised them that if they remained loyal, he would return to drive out the Vikings. He gathered intelligence about Viking movements and weaknesses. Most importantly, he planned a new type of military campaign. In May 878, Alfred emerged from the marshes. He had sent word throughout Wessex for all loyal men to meet him at Egbert's Stone, a location somewhere in eastern Wiltshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that when the Fyrd assembled, they received him as if one risen from the dead, and they were filled with great joy. This was Alfred's gamble. If few men answered his call, the resistance would collapse and Anglo-Saxon England would end forever. But if enough warriors came, he might have one chance to save his kingdom. The response exceeded Alfred's hopes. Men came from all over Wessex, nobles and peasants, young and old, some with proper weapons and others with farm tools. They had suffered under Viking rule and were ready to fight for their freedom. Alfred led this army north toward Chippenham, where Guthrum's forces were based. The two armies met at Eddington, a small village on the edge of Salisbury Plain. The Battle of Eddington was fought sometime in May 878. England's destiny hung in the balance. If Alfred lost, Anglo-Saxon civilization would disappear forever. If he won, there might still be hope for recovery. The battle lasted all day. Both sides fought with desperate courage. The Vikings had better weapons and more experience. But Alfred's men were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. As the day wore on, the Anglo-Saxon line held firm. The Vikings began to waver. Alfred seized the moment and ordered a general advance. The Viking line broke. Guthrum's army fled in panic back to their fortified camp at Chippenham. Alfred pursued them and laid siege to Chippenham. Within 2 weeks the Vikings were starving. Guthrum surrendered and agreed to negotiate. The Treaty of Wedmore changed everything. Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather. More importantly, he agreed to withdraw from Wessex permanently and accept a permanent border between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territory. The border established by the Treaty of Wedmore ran roughly from London northwest to Chester. Everything south and west of this line remained under Anglo-Saxon rule. Everything north and east became the official Danelaw, territory where Danish law and customs prevailed. But Alfred's victory at Eddington was just the beginning. He understood that military success alone wouldn't be enough to secure Wessex's future. He needed to create institutions that could resist future Viking attacks. Alfred's first innovation was military reform. The traditional Anglo-Saxon Fyrd, the militia of free men, wasn't effective against Viking tactics. Alfred reorganized it into a more professional force. Under Alfred's new system, the Fyrd was divided into two parts. Half the men served in the army at any given time, while the other half remained home to work their farms. This rotation system meant that Alfred always had troops available for campaign, but the economy wasn't completely disrupted. Alfred also established a network of fortified towns called burhs. These weren't just military strongholds, they were designed to be centres of population, trade, and administration. By 890 AD, Alfred had built over 30 burhs throughout Wessex. Every farm was within 20 miles of a fortified refuge. The burh system was revolutionary. It gave ordinary people somewhere to flee when Viking armies appeared. It provided secure bases for Alfred's own forces. Most importantly, it created a network of defended settlements that could maintain resistance even if the main army was defeated. Alfred's legal reforms were equally important. He issued a new law code, sometimes called the Doom Book, that unified West Saxon law for the first time. Previous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had used different legal customs. Alfred created one law for all his people. The Doom Book drew on multiple traditions. It included Anglo-Saxon customary law, Christian moral teachings, and biblical principles. But it also incorporated practical lessons learned from fighting the Vikings. New laws dealt with treason, military service, and the defence of fortified places. Most importantly, Alfred's laws applied to everyone in Wessex equally. Nobles and peasants were subject to the same legal procedures. This helped create a sense of common identity among all West Saxons. But Alfred's most remarkable achievement was his educational programme. The Viking invasions had devastated learning throughout England. Monasteries were destroyed, schools were closed. The ability to read Latin, the language of education and government, was almost extinct. Alfred decided to solve this problem by making education available in English rather than Latin. He personally translated or commissioned translations of the most important Latin texts into Anglo-Saxon. These included Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. Alfred's educational programme had both practical and cultural goals. He needed literate administrators to help govern Wessex effectively. But he also wanted to preserve Anglo-Saxon culture and identity for future generations. The preface to Alfred's translation of Gregory's Pastoral Care explains his vision. I began to translate into English the book that is called in Latin Pastoralis, one while word by word, another while meaning by meaning, as I had learned it from my Archbishop Plegmund, and from Asa my bishop, and from Grimbald my mass priest, and from John my mass priest. Alfred also began the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the first systematic history written in English rather than Latin. The Chronicle recorded events year by year and was distributed to monasteries throughout Alfred's kingdom. It became the primary source for English history and helped create a shared sense of national identity. Naval development was another of Alfred's innovations. The Vikings' greatest advantage was their superior ships and seamanship. Alfred decided to challenge them on their own element. Alfred ordered the construction of new warships designed specifically to fight Viking longships. These ships were longer, higher, and faster than traditional Viking vessels. They carried larger crews of professional warriors rather than farmer soldiers. Alfred's navy won its first major victory in 1882 when it captured 4 Viking ships in the Thames estuary. This was the beginning of English sea power that would eventually dominate the world's oceans. But Alfred's greatest achievement was creating a unified sense of English identity. Before the Viking invasions, people identified primarily with their local kingdoms. They were Mercians, Northumbrians, or West Saxons. Alfred began promoting the idea that all Anglo-Saxons were one people who shared common ancestors, laws, and destiny. Alfred's royal titles reflected this vision. He styled himself King of the Anglo-Saxons rather than just King of the West Saxons. This claimed authority over all English people, not just those in Wessex. Alfred's coins reinforced this message. They showed him wearing a crown and carrying the symbols of Christian kingship. The inscriptions proclaimed him as the defender of all English Christians against heathen enemies. Religious reform was central to Alfred's programme. He rebuilt destroyed monasteries and established new ones. He imported scholars from Wales, Ireland, and the continent to revive learning. He promoted the idea that God had chosen the English people for a special destiny, but only if they remained faithful to Christian principles. Alfred's vision was summed up in his famous statement about his goals: one people, one law, one faith. He wanted to unite all Anglo-Saxons under West Saxon leadership. He wanted to establish uniform legal and administrative systems. Most importantly, he wanted to create a Christian kingdom that could stand against heathen enemies. When Alfred died in 899 AD, he had achieved most of these goals. Wessex was secure and prosperous. The burh system protected the population. The Fyrd could match Viking armies in battle. A new generation of English scholars was being trained. The idea of England as a unified nation was taking root. Alfred had done more than save Wessex from Viking conquest. He had laid the foundations for the Kingdom of England that his successors would build. When Alfred the Great died in 899 AD, his life's work hung in the balance. He had saved Wessex and created the foundations for English unity. But would his successors have the vision and ability to build on his achievements? The answer came quickly from 2 remarkable leaders, his son Edward and his daughter Ethelflaed. Edward the Elder became King of Wessex in 899. His sister Ethelflaed ruled Mercia as the Lady of the Mercians. Together, they launched the systematic reconquest of the Danelaw that would create the Kingdom of England. The Viking territories north of Alfred's treaty line weren't unified under single leadership. Different Danish jarls controlled different regions. Some had established permanent kingdoms, others were still essentially military camps living off tribute and raids. This disunity gave Edward and Ethelflaed their opportunity. Their strategy was methodical and brilliant. They would advance into Danish territory and build fortified burhs to secure their gains. Each new burh became a base for further expansion. The local English population, which had been living under Danish rule for decades, generally welcomed the return of Anglo-Saxon authority. Ethelflaed was one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. She commanded armies, built fortresses, and conducted diplomacy as an equal with male rulers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records her military campaigns in the same matter-of-fact tone it used for male kings. In 910, Ethelflaed and Edward won a crushing victory over the Danish army of York at the Battle of Tettenhall. This victory eliminated the main Danish force in the Midlands and opened the way for systematic conquest. Over the next decade, the brother and sister advanced steadily into Danish territory. Edward conquered the southern Danelaw while Ethelflaed secured the Midlands. By 918, they had reclaimed everything south of the Humber River. The reconquest wasn't just military. Edward and Ethelflaed were careful to restore Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative systems in the recovered territories. They rebuilt destroyed churches and monasteries. They re-established markets and trade networks. They integrated Danish settlers who accepted Anglo-Saxon rule. Many Danes chose to stay and become English subjects. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation at Danish settlements during this period. The new English kingdom was absorbing its former enemies rather than driving them out. When Ethelflaed died in 918, Edward quickly moved to secure Mercia. The Mercian nobles accepted him as their king rather than choosing a new independent ruler. This marked the effective end of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. England was becoming a unified realm under West Saxon leadership. Edward the Elder died in 924, having extended English authority to the borders of Scotland. His son Athelstan inherited a kingdom that was larger and more powerful than any previous Anglo-Saxon realm. Athelstan was the first ruler who could legitimately call himself King of England rather than King of the Anglo-Saxons. He controlled territory from the English Channel to the Scottish Highlands. More importantly, he thought of himself as ruling a single English nation rather than a collection of separate kingdoms. Athelstan's court was the most cosmopolitan in Europe. Foreign princes sent their sons to be educated there. Continental scholars came to serve in his administration. His half-sisters married rulers across Europe, from France to Germany to Byzantium. But Athelstan's greatest test came from an unexpected alliance of his enemies. In 937, Constantine II of Scotland, Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and Owen Thums of Strathclyde joined forces to invade England. This was the largest coalition ever assembled against English power. The Allied army was massive. It included Scottish warriors, Irish Vikings, and Welsh soldiers. They invaded northern England and advanced south, expecting to destroy Athelstan's kingdom and divide England between them. Athelstan met this threat at Brunanburh, somewhere in northern England. The location of the battlefield is still debated, but the battle's importance is clear. This was a fight for the very survival of the English nation. The Battle of Brunanburh was fought on a single day in 937. Both sides knew the stakes were absolute. If the Allies won, England would be partitioned and Anglo-Saxon civilization might disappear forever. If Athelstan won, English supremacy over Britain would be established permanently. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the battle in some of its most stirring poetry. Never yet in this island, as books tell us and our ancient sages, was a greater slaughter made by the edge of the sword since the Angles and Saxons came here from the east, invading Britain over the broad seas, and the proud assailants, warriors eager for glory, overcame the Welsh and won a country. Athelstan's victory was total. Constantine II barely escaped with his life. Olaf Guthfrithson fled back to Ireland. Owen was killed on the battlefield along with thousands of allied warriors. The Battle of Brunanburh established England as the dominant power in Britain. It also created a sense of English national identity that hadn't existed before. The poets who celebrated the victory didn't praise Wessex or Mercia. They praised England and the English people. After Brunanburh, no external enemy seriously threatened England for over 60 years. Athelstan's successors, Edmund, Edred, Edwig, and Edgar, ruled a kingdom that was secure, prosperous, and increasingly unified. Edgar, who reigned from 959 to 975, became known as the Peaceful because his reign was free from major wars. This peace allowed England to develop economically and culturally in ways that had been impossible during the centuries of constant warfare. Edgar's coronation at Bath in 973 was designed to demonstrate England's new status. Representatives from all over Britain attended the ceremony. Scottish kings, Welsh princes, and Irish chieftains all acknowledged Edgar as their overlord. This was the first time in British history that one ruler had been recognised as supreme throughout the island. The ceremony itself was revolutionary. Edgar was crowned not just as a successful war leader, but as God's chosen representative on earth. The coronation service, largely written by Archbishop Dunstan, established the principle of sacred kingship that would influence English monarchy for centuries. Edgar's reign also saw the Benedictine reform, a religious revival that transformed the English Church. This movement was led by three remarkable men: Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, Archbishop of York. The Benedictine reformers believed that England's prosperity came from God's favour, which could only be maintained through proper religious observance. They established new monasteries following the strict rule of St. Benedict. They reformed existing religious houses that had grown lax. They promoted education and scholarship. The reform movement had political as well as religious goals. The reformers wanted to create a unified English church that would support royal authority. They standardized religious practices across the kingdom. They established schools that trained administrators for royal government. They created a network of monasteries that served as centres of royal influence. The cultural achievements of Edgar's reign were remarkable. The Exeter Book, one of the greatest collections of Anglo-Saxon poetry, was probably compiled during this period. The monastery at Winchester became a centre for manuscript production that rivaled anywhere in Europe. Anglo-Saxon art and architecture reached new heights of sophistication, but this golden age was fragile. It depended on continued strong leadership and external peace. Both would disappear after Edgar's death in 975. Edgar died unexpectedly at age 32, leaving two young sons by different wives. Edward, the elder son, was about 13. Ethelred, the younger, was only 7. A succession crisis erupted immediately. Edward was murdered at Corfe Castle in 978, probably on the orders of his stepmother Elfthryth, who wanted her own son Ethelred on the throne. The murder of Edward the Martyr shocked contemporaries and was seen as a sign of God's displeasure with England. Ethelred became king at age 10. His reign would last 38 years and would bring Anglo-Saxon England to the brink of extinction. Later chroniclers called him Ethelred the Unready, a pun on his name that meant ill-counselled rather than unprepared. Ethelred's early reign seemed promising enough. The kingdom was wealthy and well-organised. The administrative system created by his predecessors functioned smoothly. There were no immediate external threats, but in 980, Viking raids resumed for the first time in over 60 years. These new attacks came from Denmark and Norway, where ambitious kings were looking for ways to enrich themselves and their followers. Initially, these raids seemed like a throwback to earlier centuries, small-scale attacks on coastal monasteries and trading centres, but they quickly escalated in size and sophistication. By 990, entire Viking fleets were arriving each summer to ravage English coasts. Ethelred's response to the Viking threat was disastrous. Instead of fighting, he chose to buy the raiders off with massive tribute payments called Danegeld, literally Danish money. The first payment in 991 was £10,000 of silver. By 1012, the payment had risen to £48,000. The Danegeld strategy failed completely. Instead of discouraging Viking attacks, it encouraged them. Word spread throughout Scandinavia that the English would pay enormous sums rather than fight. More Viking fleets arrived each year, demanding ever larger payments. The tribute payments had devastating effects on English society. The government had to extract unprecedented amounts of silver from the population through taxation. Trade networks were disrupted as merchant silver was confiscated for tribute. The economic prosperity of Edgar's reign collapsed under the burden of Viking extortion. Worse still, paying Danegeld destroyed English military morale. Why should farmers risk their lives in the Fjord when the king would just pay the Vikings to go away? The military system that had conquered the Danelaw began to fall apart. The Vikings, meanwhile, grew ever more demanding. They established permanent bases in England and treated it as a tributary kingdom. The great Viking leader Olaf Tryggvason extracted tribute from England to fund his conquest of Norway. Sweyn Forkbeard used English silver to strengthen his position as King of Denmark. By 1000 AD, England was trapped in a cycle of tribute and raid that seemed impossible to break. Each payment made the next Viking demand larger. Each submission made resistance seem more hopeless. Ethelred finally tried to break this cycle with the most notorious act of his reign, the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. On November 13th, 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danish settlers living in England. The massacre was intended to eliminate the internal support network that helped Viking raiders. But it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The St. Brice's Day massacre didn't actually eliminate many Danes. Most Danish settlers lived in northern England, where local authorities ignored or couldn't implement Ethelred's orders. But it did provide Sweyn Forkbeard with perfect justification for total war against England. Sweyn's sister Gunhilda was among those killed in the massacre. He swore to avenge her death and conquer England completely. From Hamon III onward, the Viking attacks changed character entirely. This was no longer about tribute or raiding. This was about conquest. Sweyn's campaigns from Hadar III to 1013 systematically destroyed English resistance. He ravaged the countryside so thoroughly that entire regions were depopulated. He captured and burned major cities including Oxford, London and Canterbury. He forced English nobles to submit or flee into exile. The final collapse came in 1013. Sweyn landed with a massive army and was quickly accepted as king throughout the Danelaw. The southern English nobles saw no choice but to submit. Even London opened its gates without a siege. Ethelred fled to Normandy with his family. For the first time since the 9th century, England was under foreign rule. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that Alfred had saved and his successors had built seemed to have come to an inglorious end. But Sweyn's triumph was brief. He died suddenly in February 1014, just months after conquering England. The English nobles saw their chance and recalled Ethelred from exile. Ethelred's restoration led to 2 more years of devastating warfare against Sweyn's son Nut. But Ethelred died in 1016, exhausted by his failed efforts to save his kingdom. His son Edmund Ironside continued the fight for a few months, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of Asandun. By the end of 1016, Nut was undisputed King of England. The House of Wessex, which had ruled England for over a century, was extinct. The great Anglo-Saxon kingdom was now part of a Danish North Sea Empire. The transformation was complete. England had gone from being the strongest power in Britain to being a conquered province of Denmark. The institutions, laws, and culture that Alfred and his successors had created seemed destined for extinction. Yet somehow, English civilization would survive even this disaster and emerge stronger than before. Canute the Great was 21 years old when he became King of England in 1016. He had won his throne through violence and terror. English chroniclers had witnessed his armies ravaging their country for 3 years. They expected him to rule as a foreign tyrant over a conquered people. Instead, Nut surprised everyone by becoming one of England's most successful medieval kings. Nut understood that England couldn't be held by force alone. The country was too large, too wealthy, and too sophisticated to be governed as a simple military occupation. If he wanted to rule effectively, he needed to win the cooperation of the English people. His first step was to eliminate potential rivals. He had Edmund Ironside's infant sons sent into exile in Hungary, where they were expected to disappear quietly. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, to legitimize his rule and prevent Norman interference. He executed or banished the most dangerous English nobles, but Nut was careful not to alienate the entire English ruling class. He kept most existing administrators in their positions. He confirmed English laws and customs. He respected the rights of the Church. Most importantly, he presented himself as the legitimate heir to the Anglo-Saxon kings, rather than as a foreign conqueror. Nut's coins showed him wearing an English crown and carrying the traditional symbols of Anglo-Saxon kingship. His charters were written in English as well as Latin. He patronized English monasteries and commissioned English scholars. He even claimed to be the rightful avenger of Edward the Martyr, whose murder had brought God's judgment on Ethelred's reign. This policy of Anglo-Danish cooperation worked remarkably well. By 1020, most English nobles had accepted Nut as their legitimate king. The country was more peaceful and prosperous than it had been for decades. Cnut's success in England allowed him to build a North Sea empire that dominated northern Europe. He inherited the Danish throne from his brother in 1018. He conquered Norway in 1028. For a brief period, he ruled an empire that stretched from Greenland to the Baltic Sea. This empire made England the centre of a vast commercial and political network. English merchants traded freely throughout Scandinavia. English scholars and craftsmen found employment at courts across northern Europe. English silver coins became the standard currency from Dublin to Kiev. The North Sea Empire also brought England unprecedented security. For the first time in centuries, no external enemy threatened English independence. Scottish kings paid tribute to Cnut. Welsh princes sought his alliance. Irish Vikings served in his navy. Cnut's administration of England was sophisticated and effective. He divided the kingdom into 4 great earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. Each was governed by a powerful earl, who served as Nut's representative but retained considerable autonomy. 2 of these earls were Danes, Eric of Llafur in Northumbria and Thorkel the High in East Anglia. But 2 were Englishmen, Godwin in Wessex and Leofric in Mercia. This balance between Danish and English nobles helped maintain political stability. The legal system under Nut blended Danish and English traditions. His law codes confirmed that Danes living in England would follow Danish law, while English people would follow English law. But both groups were subject to the same royal authority and the same system of royal justice. Cnut's religious policies were equally balanced. He was a committed Christian who founded monasteries and went on pilgrimage to Rome, but he also respected English religious traditions and maintained close relationships with English bishops. Archbishop Wulfstan of York, one of the most influential churchmen of his time, became Nut's chief advisor on legal and religious matters. Wulfstan helped Nut craft laws that portrayed him as a Christian king, ruling by divine right, rather than a pagan conqueror ruling by force. When Nut died in 1035, his empire immediately began to collapse. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut fought over the succession. Norway and Denmark broke away. The English nobles began to reassert their independence. Harold Harefoot ruled England from 1035 to 1040, but his legitimacy was always questionable. Many English nobles preferred Harthacnut, who was Nut's son by Emma of Normandy. When Harold died suddenly in 1040, Harthacnut invaded England with a Danish army and claimed the throne. Harthacnut's reign was a disaster. He imposed crushing taxation to pay his Danish troops. He desecrated Harold Harefoot's body in revenge for usurping the throne. Most notoriously, he ordered the burning of Worcester, when the citizens killed 2 of his tax collectors. But Harthacnut's tyranny was brief. He died at a wedding feast in 1042, apparently from excessive drinking. With his death, the Danish royal line was extinct. The English nobles faced a crucial choice. They could invite another Danish prince to rule them. They could accept conquest by Magnus of Norway, who claimed to be Cnut's heir, or they could restore the native Anglo-Saxon dynasty. They chose restoration. In 1042 they recalled Edward from exile in Normandy and proclaimed him King of England. Edward was the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. He had spent most of his life in exile, but he was the last legitimate heir to the House of Wessex. Edward's restoration seemed to mark the end of foreign rule in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle celebrated his accession as a return to rightful kingship after years of Danish tyranny. English nobles who had served the Danish king smoothly transferred their loyalty to the restored English monarchy. But Edward's reign revealed how much England had changed during 26 years of Danish rule. The king who returned from Normandy was more Norman than English in his habits, language and loyalties. The nobles who welcomed him back had learned to serve foreign masters and pursue their own interests above royal authority. Most importantly, the great earldoms created by Cnut had become hereditary centres of power that rivaled the monarchy itself. Earl Godwin of Wessex controlled the richest part of England and commanded the loyalty of the entire southern nobility. His power was so great that Edward had to marry Godwin's daughter Edith to secure political stability. The Godwin family became the real power behind Edward's throne. Earl Godwin himself was a political genius who had served under Cnut, Harold Harefoot, and Harthacnut before transferring his allegiance to Edward. His sons held earldoms throughout England and commanded the best military forces in the kingdom. Harold Godwinson, Earl Godwin's eldest son, emerged as the most powerful man in England after his father's death in 1053. He ruled the vast earldom of Wessex and served as Edward's chief military commander. His brothers Tostig, Gurth, and Leofwine held the earldoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Kent, respectively. By 1060, the Godwin family controlled more of England than the king himself did. Harold commanded larger armies, controlled more revenue, and wielded more practical authority than Edward. The restored Anglo-Saxon monarchy had become dependent on the very nobles who were supposed to serve it. This balance of power created the crisis that would destroy Anglo-Saxon England. Edward was childless and growing old. When he died, there would be no clear heir to the throne. The most powerful man in England would be Harold Godwinson, but Harold was not of royal blood. Several other claimants had stronger legal claims to the English throne. William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the succession. Harold Hardrada of Norway claimed to be the heir to Knut's North Sea Empire. Edgar Atheling was Edward's great-nephew and the closest living relative of the Anglo-Saxon royal house. Edward died on January 5, 1066, without naming a clear successor. The kingdom that had survived Danish conquest, civil war, and foreign domination now faced its greatest crisis since the Viking invasions. The English nobles faced an impossible choice. They could elect Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England but not of royal blood. They could accept foreign rule under William or Harold, or they could choose Edgar Atheling, who had royal blood but no political support. They chose Harold Godwinson. On January 6, 1066, the day after Edward's funeral, Harold was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The speed of the coronation showed that Harold and his supporters knew their claim was questionable and wanted to present foreign challengers with a fait accompli, but Harold's coronation was the beginning, not the end, of the succession crisis. Both William of Normandy and Harold Hardrada immediately began preparing invasions to claim what they considered their rightful throne. 1066 became the year of three kings. Edward, Harold, and William would all hold the English crown before Christmas. The fate of Anglo-Saxon England would be decided in a single year of desperate warfare. The Norwegian invasion came first. Harold Hardrada landed in Yorkshire in September 1066 with a massive army. He was supported by Harold's exiled brother Tostig, who had been driven from his earldom of Northumbria the previous year. Harold Hardrada was the most feared warrior king in Europe. He had served as a mercenary in Byzantium, conquered much of Denmark, and earned a reputation for military genius throughout the Viking world. His invasion force was the largest ever to land in England. Harold Godwinson responded with characteristic energy and skill. He marched his army north at unprecedented speed, covering nearly 200 miles in less than a week. On September 25, 1066, he caught the Norwegian army by surprise at Stamford Bridge near York. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was one of the most decisive victories in English history. The Norwegian army was virtually annihilated. Harold Hardrada was killed, along with most of his jarls and warriors. Tostig also died on the battlefield. The survivors needed only 24 ships to carry them home, although they had arrived with over 300. Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Never again would Scandinavian armies seriously threaten English independence. The victory seemed to prove that Harold Godwinson was truly England's rightful king, blessed with divine favour and military genius. But Harold's triumph was brief. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey with another invasion army. Harold had to march his exhausted troops 300 miles south to face a completely fresh enemy. The two armies met at Hastings on October 14, 1066. This battle would determine not just who ruled England, but what kind of civilization England would become. Harold's army was tired from the march south, but it was filled with veterans who had just won a crushing victory over the most feared warriors in Europe. They held the high ground on Senlac Hill and were protected by a shield wall that had proved impregnable against Norwegian axes and spears. William's army was fresh and well equipped, but it was fighting on foreign soil against desperate defenders. The Normans had cavalry, which the English lacked, but mounted knights had never been tested against disciplined Anglo-Saxon infantry. The battle lasted all day. The English shield wall held firm against repeated Norman charges. William's horse was killed under him, and rumours spread that he was dead. The Norman advance nearly collapsed into panic, but William rallied his men and ordered a feigned retreat. Part of the English line broke formation to pursue what they thought were fleeing enemies. The Norman cavalry turned and cut down the scattered English troops. As the day wore on, the English line grew thinner. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine were killed. The king himself fought in the front rank, wielding his battle-axe with desperate courage. But gradually Norman arrows and spears found their mark. Harold fell late in the afternoon, struck down near his personal standard. With the king's death, English resistance collapsed. The survivors fled into the gathering darkness, leaving the field to the Norman conquerors. The Battle of Hastings ended Anglo-Saxon England forever. A civilization that had survived Roman withdrawal, Saxon invasion, Viking conquest and Danish occupation had finally met its match. The Norman conquest was about to begin, but Anglo-Saxon England didn't simply disappear. The language, laws, customs and institutions that had developed over 6 centuries would survive under Norman rule. They would be transformed, but not destroyed. The England that emerged from the conquest would be neither purely Norman nor purely Anglo-Saxon, but a fusion of both traditions. The story of medieval England was just beginning. William the Bastard had won the crown of England, but he had not yet won England itself. The victory at Hastings eliminated Harold Godwinson and scattered the English army. But most of the country remained unconquered. English nobles still controlled their estates. English bishops still ran their churches. English laws still governed the people. William understood that military victory was just the beginning. He needed to transform England from a conquered territory into a functioning Norman kingdom. This transformation would take 20 years and would change English society forever. The immediate aftermath of Hastings was chaos. William's army had been fighting for a full day and needed rest. The English survivors had fled in all directions, spreading news of the disaster. Some English nobles began preparing resistance. Others started negotiating with the Norman invaders. William moved carefully at first. He advanced slowly toward London, allowing time for English resistance to organise or collapse. He offered terms to English nobles who would submit voluntarily. He presented himself as Edward the Confessor's rightful heir, rather than a foreign conqueror. Some English leaders were ready to accept Norman rule. Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury and Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, both submitted to William within weeks of Hastings. the citizens of London opened their gates without a siege. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony followed Anglo-Saxon traditions, emphasising continuity with previous English kings. But it also introduced Norman customs that would reshape English royal ritual forever. The coronation was disrupted by violence that revealed the tensions beneath the surface. When the congregation shouted their approval of William's kingship, Norman guards outside the abbey thought a riot had started. They began burning nearby buildings and attacking English civilians. This incident set the pattern for Norman rule. William wanted to present himself as the legitimate successor to Edward the Confessor, but his followers were foreign soldiers who saw England as conquered territory to be exploited. The first major test of Norman rule came in 1068 when Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, rebelled against William's authority. These were the most powerful surviving English nobles, and their revolt threatened to unite all resistance under native leadership. William's response was swift and decisive. He marched north with a large army and defeated the rebels before they could coordinate their forces. Edwin and Morcar submitted and were pardoned, but their estates were confiscated and given to Norman followers. This established the pattern for Norman conquest. English nobles who resisted lost everything. Their lands were granted to Norman knights who owed military service directly to the king. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically replaced by foreign warriors. The greatest test came in 1069 with a massive rebellion across northern England. The rebels were supported by a Danish invasion fleet that landed in the Humber. For a moment it seemed possible that foreign intervention might reverse the Norman conquest. The rebellion began in York, where English rebels massacred the Norman garrison and burned the castle. The uprising spread across Yorkshire and Northumbria. Danish troops joined with English rebels to besiege Norman strongholds throughout the region. William's response was more brutal than anything England had seen since the Viking invasions. He launched what became known as the Harrying of the North, a systematic campaign of destruction designed to eliminate resistance permanently. The harrying lasted through the winter of 1069-1070. Norman armies burned every village, destroyed every crop, and slaughtered every animal they could find across Yorkshire and Northumbria. The goal wasn't just military victory. It was the complete devastation of the region's ability to support rebellion. The destruction was so thorough that parts of northern England took generations to recover. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, still recorded vast areas as waste, completely uninhabited and unproductive. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of the devastation. Contemporary chroniclers were horrified by the brutality. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman monk, wrote that William made no distinction of age or sex, but gave cruel orders for all to be slain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that he ravaged and laid waste that shire so completely that it remained barren for decades. The harrying of the North achieved its strategic goal. Northern England never rebelled against Norman rule again, but it also demonstrated the iron fist beneath William's claims to legitimate kingship. England would be Norman whether the English liked it or not. The last major resistance came from Hereward the Wake, an Anglo-Saxon thane who established a rebel stronghold in the fenlands of East Anglia. Hereward's rebellion lasted from 1070 to 1071 and became legendary as the final stand of Anglo-Saxon independence. Hereward was everything the Normans were not. He was a native Englishman fighting on familiar ground. He used guerrilla tactics rather than pitched battles. He relied on local support rather than foreign allies. Most importantly, he represented the Anglo-Saxon values of personal loyalty and resistance to tyranny. The Isle of Ely, where Hereward made his base, was perfect for guerrilla warfare. It was surrounded by marshes and waterways that only locals could navigate safely. Norman cavalry was useless in this terrain. Heavy armour became a liability rather than an advantage. For over a year, Hereward's forces raided Norman settlements and ambushed Norman patrols. They captured supplies, freed prisoners, and maintained a symbol of English resistance that inspired rebels across the country. William eventually overcame Hereward through engineering rather than military force. He ordered the construction of a causeway across the marshes, allowing his armies to reach the Isle of Ely directly. Faced with inevitable defeat, most of Hereward's followers negotiated pardons and surrendered. Hereward himself disappeared from history at this point. Later legends claimed he escaped and continued fighting, but contemporary sources suggest he also submitted and was pardoned. Either way, his rebellion marked the end of organised Anglo-Saxon resistance. By 1071, Norman control over England was complete, but William still faced the enormous task of governing a foreign country whose people spoke a different language, followed different laws, and practiced different customs. The solution was the Domesday Book, the most comprehensive survey of any medieval kingdom. Commissioned in 1085 and completed in 1086, this massive document recorded the ownership, value and resources of virtually every estate in England. The Domesday Book served multiple purposes. It established legal title to lands that had been confiscated from English nobles and granted to Norman followers. It provided the information needed for efficient taxation. Most importantly, it demonstrated the new government's unprecedented administrative capacity. The survey was incredibly detailed. It recorded not just who owned each estate, but how much land they held, how many people lived on it, what animals they owned, and what the property had been worth before and after the conquest. Nothing like this had ever been attempted anywhere in Europe. English people were amazed and terrified by the thoroughness of the survey. They called it Domesday because, like God's final judgment, nothing could be hidden from it. The nickname stuck, and the document is still known as the Domesday Book today. The Domesday Book revealed the scale of the Norman transformation. By 1086, only about 5% of English land remained in Anglo-Saxon hands. The rest had been redistributed to Norman nobles, foreign churchmen, and the king himself. An entire ruling class had been replaced within a single generation. This land redistribution established feudalism as England's new social system. Under Anglo-Saxon rule, nobles had held their estates by inheritance or royal grant, but with considerable independence. Under Norman feudalism, all land belonged ultimately to the king, who granted it to nobles in exchange for specific military and financial obligations. Every Norman landholder owed military service to the king. They had to provide a fixed number of fully equipped knights for royal campaigns. They also owed financial payments and administrative service. This created a much more centralized and efficient military system than had existed under Anglo-Saxon rule. The introduction of feudalism was accompanied by a massive castle-building program that transformed the English landscape. The Normans built over 500 castles in the first century after the conquest. These weren't just military fortifications, they were symbols of Norman authority and centres of local administration. Early Norman castles were relatively simple structures. They typically consisted of a wooden tower built on an artificial mound, surrounded by a wooden palisade and earthwork defences. These motte and bailey castles could be built quickly by local labour under Norman supervision. But William also began construction of the great stone fortresses that would dominate England for centuries. The Tower of London, begun around 1078, was designed to overawe the citizens of England's largest city. Its massive stone walls proclaimed that Norman rule was permanent and unshakable. Castle building served practical as well as symbolic purposes. Each castle controlled the surrounding countryside and provided a secure base for Norman troops. The network of castles allowed a relatively small number of Norman warriors to control a much larger English population. The transformation of England wasn't just political and military, it was cultural and linguistic. The Norman conquest created a multilingual society where different languages served different functions. Norman French became the language of the royal court, the nobility, and government administration. All official documents were written in French or Latin. English nobles who wanted to advance in Norman society had to learn French. The language of power was no longer English. Latin remained the language of the church and of scholarship. The Norman bishops and abbots who replaced their English predecessors conducted services in Latin and wrote their chronicles in Latin. Education continued to be based on Latin texts and Latin grammar. English survived as the language of the common people, but it was relegated to second-class status. English was no longer used for government, law, or formal literature. It began absorbing thousands of French words related to government, law, warfare, and sophisticated culture. This linguistic division reflected the social division that the conquest had created. Norman French speakers were the rulers, English speakers were the ruled. This language barrier would persist for over 2 centuries and would fundamentally alter the development of the English language. The Church underwent equally dramatic transformation under Norman rule. William and his successors systematically replaced English bishops and abbots with Norman appointees. By 1096, only one English bishop remained in the entire country. The leading figure in church reform was Lanfranc, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. Lanfranc was a brilliant Italian scholar who had served as prior of the monastery at Bec in Normandy. He brought continental European standards of learning, discipline, and organisation to the English Church. Under Lanfranc's leadership, the English Church was reorganised according to Norman models. Cathedral schools were established to train priests and administrators. Monastic life was reformed according to strict continental rules. Church law was codified and enforced more systematically than ever before. The Norman transformation of the Church had lasting consequences. English Christianity became more closely integrated with continental European developments. English monasteries began producing scholarship that could compete with the best work being done in France or Italy. The English Church became a more effective partner in royal government, but this transformation also meant the end of the distinctive Anglo-Saxon Christian tradition. The beautiful illuminated manuscripts, the vernacular religious poetry, the intimate connection between English saints and English soil. All of this was swept away by Norman reforms. By 1087, when William the Conqueror died, England had been transformed beyond recognition. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom was gone forever. In its place was a Norman realm that was more centralized, more militarized, and more connected to continental Europe than anything that had existed before. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required systematic violence, mass deportations, and the destruction of an entire culture. But it had created a new kind of medieval kingdom that would prove remarkably successful and enduring. William died on September 9, 1087, from injuries received in a riding accident. His death immediately raised the question that would plague medieval England for centuries. How should the crown pass from one generation to the next? William the Conqueror had 3 surviving sons when he died in 1087. Robert Curthose inherited the Duchy of Normandy. William Rufus received the Kingdom of England. Henry got £5,000 of silver and no land at all. This division would create 40 years of warfare and instability. The problem was obvious to everyone except William the Conqueror. England and Normandy were economically and politically connected. Norman nobles held estates on both sides of the Channel. The English crown derived much of its prestige from its Norman origins. Dividing the inheritance meant dividing the Norman realm just when unity was most needed. William Rufus became King of England, but his authority was immediately challenged. Many Norman nobles preferred his older brother Robert Curthose, who seemed more generous and easier to control. In 1088 they rebelled against Rufus in favour of reuniting England and Normandy under Robert's rule. The rebellion failed because Rufus won the support of the English people. This was ironic, since Rufus was more Norman than his father, and showed little interest in English customs or concerns. But the English preferred a resident king to an absentee ruler, even if that king was a foreign tyrant. Rufus proved to be exactly that. His reign from 1087 to 1100 was marked by constant warfare, crushing taxation, and systematic exploitation of the Church. English chroniclers called him the worst king since Ethelred the Unready. Even Norman sources criticised his greed and cruelty. The king's nickname, Rufus, meant the Red, possibly referring to his ruddy complexion, but more likely to his violent temper. He was unmarried and apparently uninterested in women, leading to speculation about his sexual preferences that scandalized medieval chroniclers. Rufus fought 3 major wars against his brother Robert for control of Normandy. These campaigns were expensive and largely unsuccessful. Rufus won some individual battles, but he never achieved his goal of reuniting his father's dominions under English rule. To pay for these wars, Rufus imposed unprecedented taxation on England. He extracted money from every possible source. When bishops or abbots died, he delayed appointing replacements and kept the church revenues for himself. He sold royal offices to the highest bidder. He fined nobles for trivial offences. The most notorious example of Rufus's greed was his treatment of the New Forest. William the Conqueror had created this royal hunting preserve by destroying dozens of villages and evicting their inhabitants. Rufus expanded the forest and imposed savage penalties on anyone caught hunting there without permission. English folklore blamed the New Forest for Rufus's death. On August 2nd to 1100, the king was hunting there with a small party of nobles. An arrow shot by Walter Tyrrell struck and killed the king instantly. Whether this was an accident or assassination has never been determined. The circumstances were certainly suspicious. Henry, the king's youngest brother, was in the hunting party, but quickly rode to Winchester to secure the royal treasury. He was crowned king within days, before news of Rufus's death could reach Robert Curthose in Normandy. Contemporary chroniclers claimed the death was God's judgment on a wicked king. They reported supernatural omens and divine warnings that preceded the fatal hunt, but they were careful not to accuse Henry of arranging his brother's murder. Henry thus's usurpation of the English crown led to another war with Robert Curthose. This conflict lasted until 1106, when Henry decisively defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebrai. Robert was captured and spent the remaining 28 years of his life as Henry's prisoner. The Battle of Tinchebrai was significant because it reunited England and Normandy under English rule. For the first time since 1066, the Norman realm was governed from England rather than from Normandy. This shift would have lasting consequences for both countries. Henry then proved to be a much more effective king than his predecessor. His reign from 1100 to 1135 was marked by administrative innovation, economic growth, and relative peace. English chroniclers praised him as a just ruler who restored law and order after the chaos of Rufus's reign. Henry's greatest achievement was the development of royal government. He created new administrative offices, standardized legal procedures, and established regular systems for taxation and justice. The Pipe Rolls, annual records of royal finances, began during his reign and provide detailed information about how medieval government actually worked. The king surrounded himself with talented administrators rather than just military companions. Men like Roger of Salisbury, the Chief Justiciar, created bureaucratic systems that could function effectively whether the king was present or not. This was crucial since Henry spent about half his time in Normandy. Royal justice expanded significantly under Henry thus. The king's courts began hearing cases that had previously been handled by local nobles or church officials. Royal justices travelled throughout England hearing cases and enforcing royal law. The foundations of English common law were laid during this period. Economic growth accelerated under Henry's stable government. Towns expanded and new ones were founded. Trade increased both within England and with continental Europe. The population grew steadily, putting pressure on available land but also creating new markets for goods and services. The development of Anglo-Norman culture was another significant achievement of Henry's reign. By 1120, a distinctive civilization had emerged that combined Norman political organization with English wealth and traditions. This fusion created something new, neither purely Norman nor purely English, but specifically Anglo-Norman. Anglo-Norman literature flourished during this period. The Chanson de Geste celebrating Norman military prowess was adapted to English settings. Historical chronicles began presenting the Norman conquest as part of English history rather than as a foreign intrusion. Romantic poetry explored themes of chivalry and courtly love. Architecture also reflected this cultural fusion. Norman Romanesque churches were built throughout England, but they incorporated decorative elements and spatial arrangements that were distinctively English. Durham Cathedral, completed during Henry's reign, is the masterpiece of Anglo-Norman architecture, but Henry's success created its own problems. The administrative system he built required constant royal oversight. The legal innovations he introduced needed consistent enforcement. Most importantly, the reunited Anglo-Norman realm needed a strong ruler to hold it together. This became a crisis when Henry's only legitimate son, William Etheling, died in the White Ship disaster of 1120. The prince was returning from Normandy when his ship struck a rock and sank in the English Channel. Almost everyone aboard drowned, including many young nobles who represented the future of Anglo-Norman society. The White Ship disaster devastated Henry personally and politically. He had many illegitimate children, but only one surviving legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. Medieval inheritance customs strongly favoured male heirs. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right. Henry tried to solve this problem by making his nobles swear to accept Matilda as his successor. In 1127, he forced all the great barons to take an oath supporting her claim to the throne, but these oaths were extracted under pressure, and many nobles had mental reservations about accepting female rule. The succession problem was complicated by Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou. The Angevins were traditional enemies of the Normans. English and Norman nobles were horrified at the prospect of being ruled by an Angevin prince through his wife's inheritance. Henry also began developing new concepts of royal authority that would later contribute to the growth of parliamentary government. He regularly consulted with his nobles and bishops in formal councils. He established procedures for nobles to petition the crown for redress of grievances. He created precedents for limiting royal power through law. These innovations weren't intended to limit monarchy. Henry was trying to make royal government more efficient and responsive. But they established principles that would later be used to constrain royal authority and create constitutional government. When Henry I died in 1135, he left England more prosperous and better governed than it had been since the Norman conquest. But he also left a succession crisis that would plunge the country into civil war for nearly 2 decades. The nobles who had sworn to support Matilda quickly found reasons to break their oaths. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne with the support of the church and many barons. Matilda and her husband Geoffrey prepared to fight for her inheritance. The stage was set for the Anarchy, the first English civil war since the Norman conquest. Stephen of Blois moved quickly to claim the English throne after Henry III's death. He crossed the Channel within days and secured the support of key nobles and church leaders. On December 27, 1135, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. Stephen had several advantages in claiming the crown. He was male, which medieval custom strongly favoured. He was in England when Henry died, while Matilda was in Anjou. Most importantly, he was charming, generous, and popular with the nobles who would determine the succession. But Stephen's claim was legally weak. He had sworn to support Matilda's succession in 1127. His usurpation violated both his oath and Henry I's explicit wishes. When Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou prepared to fight for her rights, England faced its first civil war since the Norman conquest. The war that followed became known as the Anarchy. It lasted from 1135 to 1153 and devastated England more thoroughly than any conflict since the Viking invasions. Contemporary chroniclers described it as a time when God and his angels slept. The conflict wasn't just about succession. It revealed deeper tensions within Anglo-Norman society. The centralized government that Henry I had built depended on royal authority being respected and enforced. Once that authority was challenged, the entire system began to collapse. Regional differences that had been suppressed under strong royal rule now emerged. Northern England, with its memories of Anglo-Saxon independence, supported different claimants than the south. The Welsh and Scottish borders became zones of constant warfare. Local nobles began acting like independent rulers. The first phase of the war went badly for Stephen. In 1139, Matilda landed in England with a small army and established her base at Bristol. She was supported by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful nobles in England, and by several other magnates who had grown dissatisfied with Stephen's rule. Matilda's cause received a crucial boost in 1141 when Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln. With the king in prison, Matilda advanced to London and prepared for her coronation. For a few months, it seemed that she had won the civil war, but Matilda's triumph was brief. She alienated potential supporters through arrogance and tactlessness. When she demanded money from the citizens of London, they drove her out of the city in a riot. Stephen was exchanged for Robert of Gloucester, who had also been captured, and the war continued. The capture and release of both Stephen and Robert of Gloucester marked the beginning of the most destructive phase of the Civil War. Neither side could achieve decisive victory, but both continued fighting. England was torn apart by a conflict that nobody could win. The breakdown of royal authority had immediate consequences. Nobles who had been constrained by Henry III's strong government began building unauthorized castles and pursuing private wars. The careful administrative system that had governed England for decades simply stopped functioning. Castle building proliferated during the anarchy in ways that would have been impossible under strong royal rule. Contemporary chroniclers reported that over 100 new castles were built during Stephen's reign. Most were simple fortifications, but they gave local nobles the ability to defy royal authority. These adulterine, unauthorized castles became centres of private warfare and local oppression. Noble families that had been enemies for generations could now fight openly. Personal disputes that would have been resolved in royal courts were settled by force of arms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captured the horror of this breakdown. Every powerful man made his castles and held them against the king. They filled the land full of castles. They cruelly oppressed the wretched people by making them work at these castles, and when the castles were finished they filled them with devils and evil men. Trade and commerce collapsed under these conditions. Merchants couldn't travel safely between towns. Markets were disrupted by warfare. Currency became unreliable as local nobles began minting their own coins. The economic prosperity of Henry III's reign disappeared within a few years. The Church tried to mediate between the warring parties, but found itself drawn into the conflict. Some bishops supported Stephen, others backed Matilda. Monasteries were looted by both sides. Church property was seized to pay soldiers. The moral authority that might have ended the war was compromised by the Church's own divisions. Rural areas suffered worst of all. Armies from both sides lived off the land, seizing crops and livestock from peasant farmers. Villages were burned, fields left unploughed, and entire regions depopulated. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements abandoned during the anarchy were never reoccupied. The chronicler of Peterborough Abbey wrote, "I know not how to, nor can I tell of all the horrors and all the tortures which they did to wretched men in this land, and that lasted the 19 winters while Stephen was king, and it was always going from bad to worse." Regional differences that had been suppressed under Norman rule now re-emerged. Northern England, which had never fully accepted Norman authority, began developing its own political identity. Yorkshire nobles formed alliances with Scottish kings. Northumbrian castles were built to resist southern authority as much as foreign invasion. The Welsh took advantage of English weakness to reclaim territory lost since the Norman conquest. Welsh princes like Owain Gwynedd and Rhys ap Gruffydd established independent kingdoms that acknowledged no English overlordship. The Norman advance into Wales was reversed for the first time since 1066. Scotland also benefited from English chaos. King David thus invaded northern England repeatedly, claiming to support Matilda's cause but actually seizing territory for himself. The Battle of the Standard in 1138 checked Scottish expansion, but didn't eliminate the threat. By 1150, England was exhausted by 15 years of civil war. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could achieve decisive victory. Both sides had lost many of their original supporters. The country desperately needed peace, but neither claimant was willing to concede defeat. The solution came from an unexpected source. Matilda's son Henry had grown up during the Civil War and had come of age as a formidable military and political leader. In 1150, at age 17, he began his own campaign for the English throne. Henry of Anjou had several advantages that his mother lacked. He was male, which satisfied medieval prejudices about female rule. He was energetic and charismatic, unlike the aging Stephen. Most importantly, he represented a new generation that was tired of the old conflicts. Henry's position was strengthened dramatically by his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. This marriage made him ruler of western France from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. He now controlled more territory than the King of France himself. In 1153, Henry invaded England with a large army. But instead of continuing the civil war, both sides decided to negotiate. The nobles were exhausted by warfare. The church desperately wanted peace. Even Stephen was ready to compromise rather than fight another campaign. The Treaty of Wallingford, signed in November 1153, ended the anarchy through a face-saving compromise. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry would be recognised as his heir. When Stephen died, the crown would pass peacefully to Henry. Stephen died less than a year later, in October 1154. Henry crossed the Channel immediately and was crowned King Henry II at Westminster Abbey on December 19, 1154. The anarchy was over, but its consequences would shape English history for generations. The Civil War had taught important lessons about medieval government. Strong royal authority was essential for maintaining peace and prosperity, but that authority had to be exercised within accepted legal and constitutional limits. Kings who violated custom and law risked losing the support they needed to govern effectively. The anarchy also demonstrated the importance of clear succession laws. The uncertainty over female inheritance had created the crisis in the first place. Future rulers would be more careful to establish unambiguous procedures for passing the crown from one generation to the next. Most importantly, the Civil War had shown that England needed institutions that could survive weak or disputed kingship. The personal government that had worked under strong rulers like William the Conqueror and Henry I wasn't sufficient for long-term stability. England needed administrative and legal systems that could function regardless of who occupied the throne. Henry II would spend the first years of his reign addressing these problems. He would destroy unauthorized castles, restore royal justice, and create governmental institutions that could outlast any individual monarch. The lessons learned during the anarchy would help create the foundations of medieval England's golden age. Henry Plantagenet was 21 years old when he became King of England in 1154. He had already earned a reputation for boundless energy and decisive action. More importantly, he ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains. No English king had ever controlled so much territory. The House of Plantagenet originated in the French county of Anjou. Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, had married the Empress Matilda during the succession crisis that followed Henry III's death. Their son inherited claims to both England and vast French territories through his parents' marriage. But Henry was more than just the heir to competing claims. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 had made him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. Eleanor brought him control of Aquitaine, Poitou and Gascony, nearly a third of modern France. Combined with his inherited lands in Normandy and Anjou, Henry's domains were larger than those of the French king himself. This vast assemblage of lands became known as the Angevin Empire. It wasn't a unified state in the modern sense. Each region had its own laws, customs, and administrative systems, but they were all ruled by the same man, and that gave Henry unprecedented resources for governing England. Henry's first priority was restoring royal authority after the chaos of Stephen's reign. The anarchy had left England with over 100 unauthorized castles and nobles who had grown accustomed to acting independently. Henry moved systematically to destroy this legacy of civil war. The king ordered the destruction of all adulterine castles built during the previous reign. Nobles who resisted faced immediate military action. Henry had the resources to enforce his will. He could bring soldiers from Normandy, Anjou, or Aquitaine to crush any English rebellion. Most nobles submitted without fighting. They had seen enough warfare during the anarchy to know the costs of resistance. Within 5 years, Henry had eliminated most unauthorized fortifications and restored royal control over the English countryside. But destroying illegal castles was only the beginning. Henry needed to create institutions that would prevent future breakdowns of royal authority. His solution was a legal revolution that would transform English society forever. Henry's legal reforms established common law as the foundation of English justice. Before his reign, different regions of England had used different legal systems. Norman areas followed Norman customs. Danish areas used Danish law. Anglo-Saxon regions retained Anglo-Saxon traditions. Henry decided to create one law for all of England. Royal justices would travel throughout the kingdom hearing cases and applying uniform legal standards. Local customs would be respected, but they would be subordinated to royal law when conflicts arose. The system of royal justice that Henry created was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people could appeal to the king's courts, instead of relying on local nobles or church officials. Royal writs provided standardized legal procedures that worked the same way everywhere in England. Henry's justices developed new legal remedies that proved extremely popular. The writ of novel disseisin protected people who had been illegally dispossessed of their land. The writ of mordancester helped heirs recover inheritances. The writ of right provided access to royal courts for property disputes. These legal innovations had profound social consequences. They strengthened the position of free landholders against their feudal superiors. They provided legal protection for merchants and craftsmen. Most importantly, they created a sense that all English people were subject to the same law. The development of common law also strengthened royal government. Every legal case heard in royal courts brought fees to the royal treasury. Every judgment rendered reinforced royal authority throughout the kingdom. The law became both a source of revenue and a tool of political control. But Henry's legal reforms created an unexpected conflict with the most powerful institution in medieval society, the Catholic Church. The crisis began with Henry's appointment of Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Becket had served as Henry's chancellor and closest adviser. The king expected him to continue supporting royal policies after becoming archbishop. Instead, Becket underwent what seemed to be a complete personality transformation. The worldly courtier became an ascetic monk. The loyal royal servant became a fierce defender of church independence. The pragmatic administrator became an uncompromising champion of ecclesiastical privilege. The specific issue that triggered the conflict was the punishment of criminous clerks, members of the clergy who committed secular crimes. Church law claimed that clergy could only be tried in church courts, which could not impose death penalties. Royal law demanded that serious criminals face royal justice regardless of their clerical status. Henry's position was reasonable. Why should a clerk who committed murder or rape receive lighter punishment than a layman who committed the same crimes? The system of separate church courts for clergy created obvious inequities and undermined royal authority. But Becket refused to compromise. He claimed that any concession on clerical immunity would destroy the Church's independence from secular authority. The dispute escalated when Becket fled to France and began issuing excommunications against royal supporters. The conflict lasted for 6 years and attracted attention throughout Europe. The Pope supported Becket's position, but tried to avoid a complete break with Henry. The French king offered Becket sanctuary and encouraged his resistance. The German emperor backed Henry's claims about royal authority. The crisis reached its climax in December 1170. Henry and Becket had apparently reached a reconciliation, and the archbishop returned to Canterbury. But Becket immediately began excommunicating bishops who had supported the king during his exile. Henry exploded in rage when he learned of Becket's actions. According to later accounts, he shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights who heard these words rode to Canterbury and murdered Becket in his own cathedral on December 29, 1170. The murder of Thomas Becket shocked the medieval world. Here was an archbishop, a prince of the church, killed by royal servants in the most sacred space in England. Miracles were reported at Becket's tomb within days of his death. Popular opinion immediately declared him a martyr. Henry was forced into a humiliating public penance. He walked barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral and allowed himself to be flogged by the monks. He also had to make significant concessions on the issues that had caused the original conflict. Clergy would continue to enjoy special legal privileges, but the Becket affair, despite its immediate embarrassment for Henry, actually strengthened royal government in the long run. The king's dramatic penance demonstrated that even royal authority was subject to moral and legal limits. This paradoxically increased respect for monarchy by showing that it operated within accepted bounds. The crisis also established an important principle in English political development. The rule of law applied to everyone, including the king. This concept would later evolve into constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government. While dealing with these domestic challenges, Henry was also managing the most complex political situation in medieval Europe. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had brought him enormous territorial wealth, but it had also brought him the most formidable woman of her generation. Eleanor of Aquitaine was already a legend when she married Henry. She had been Queen of France through her first marriage to Louis VII, whom she had divorced after bearing him only daughters. She had participated in the Second Crusade and had witnessed the politics of the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states. As Henry's queen, Eleanor ruled Aquitaine in her own right while also serving as regent in England when the king was absent. She held her own court, issued her own charters, and commanded the loyalty of the southern French nobility. Medieval chroniclers called her the most powerful woman in Europe. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was passionate but turbulent. They had 8 children together, including the future kings Richard and John, but they also had fundamental disagreements about how their vast empire should be governed. The tensions came to a head in 1173 when Eleanor supported a rebellion by their eldest son Henry, the young king. This revolt was supported by the kings of France and Scotland, who saw an opportunity to dismember the Angevin Empire while it was divided against itself. The young king's revolt revealed the fundamental weakness of Henry's empire. It was held together only by personal loyalty to the king himself. When his own family turned against him, the entire structure began to collapse. Henry ultimately suppressed the rebellion through superior military resources and political skill. He defeated the young king's forces in Normandy, while his supporters crushed the Scottish invasion of northern England. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned for the remainder of Henry's reign, but the family warfare had lasting consequences. It demonstrated that the Angevin Empire was too large and diverse to be governed effectively by any single ruler. It also established the pattern of fraternal rivalry that would plague the Plantagenet dynasty for centuries. During these years of domestic and continental conflict, Henry also began the expansion of English authority into Ireland. This intervention would have consequences that lasted for over 800 years. The immediate cause of English involvement in Ireland was a succession dispute in the Kingdom of Leinster. Dermot MacMurrough, who had been driven from his throne by rival Irish kings, appealed to Henry for military assistance in recovering his kingdom. Henry gave Dermot permission to recruit soldiers in England and Wales, but did not provide direct royal support. The result was the arrival of Anglo-Norman adventurers led by Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known as Strongbow. Strongbow's forces used superior military technology and tactics to achieve rapid success in Ireland. Norman heavy cavalry and professional soldiers proved devastatingly effective against traditional Irish warfare. Within 2 years, Strongbow had not only restored Dermot to his throne, but had also conquered much of Eastern Ireland. Henry became alarmed by Strongbow's success. He feared that a powerful Anglo-Norman state in Ireland might become independent of English control. In 1171, Henry personally invaded Ireland with a large army to assert royal authority over the Norman conquerors. The Irish expedition was a military and diplomatic success. The Anglo-Norman lords submitted to Henry and received formal grants of their Irish conquests. Many Irish kings also acknowledged Henry as their overlord, preferring distant English authority to the immediate threat of Norman conquest. Henry's intervention established the lordship of Ireland as part of the English crown. This created a colonial relationship that would shape Irish history for centuries. English law, customs, and administrative systems were gradually extended throughout the conquered territories. The Irish adventure demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Angevin government. Henry could project military power effectively across great distances and create new governmental structures in conquered territories. But he could not provide the sustained attention needed to consolidate these gains permanently. This pattern of brilliant initial success followed by gradual erosion characterized much of Henry's reign. He created impressive institutions and achieved remarkable military victories, but the sheer scale of his empire made sustained success impossible. The problem became acute as Henry aged and his sons reached maturity. Richard, his eldest surviving son after the young king's death in 1183, was primarily interested in crusading and showed little aptitude for government. John, the younger son, was ambitious but untrustworthy and had already rebelled against his father once. Henry's final years were marked by renewed warfare with his sons and the French king. Richard allied with Philip Augustus of France against his own father, demanding immediate recognition as Henry's heir and control over Angevin territories in France. The combination of family rebellion and external pressure proved too much for even Henry's considerable abilities. He was forced to recognize Richard as his heir and to make humiliating concessions to the French king. The great Angevin empire that had dominated Europe for 35 years was beginning to crumble. Henry II died at Chinon Castle on July 6, 1189, reportedly cursing his ungrateful sons with his dying breath. He had transformed England from a war-torn kingdom into the centre of a European empire. He had created legal and administrative institutions that would outlast his dynasty. But he had also established the pattern of family conflict that would ultimately destroy Plantagenet power. Richard the I inherited the throne of England, but his interests lay elsewhere. The Third Crusade was beginning, and Richard was determined to win glory in the Holy Land. England would have to govern itself while its king pursued his dreams of military fame in the distant East. Richard was crowned King of England on September 3, 1189, at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent, befitting a king who ruled territories from Scotland to Spain. But Richard's heart was already set on Jerusalem. He had taken the cross, sworn to go on crusade, before his father's death, and he intended to honour that vow. England, for Richard, was primarily valuable as a source of money for his crusading adventure. He famously declared that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. This wasn't entirely a joke. Richard systematically extracted every possible penny from his English subjects to fund his expedition to the Holy Land. The new king sold royal offices, castles, and privileges to anyone who could pay. He released the King of Scotland from his feudal obligations for 10,000 marks. He confirmed town charters and granted new ones in exchange for substantial payments. Most controversially, he sold the office of Chancellor to William Longchamp, a Norman who knew no English and cared nothing for English customs. These fundraising activities brought in enormous sums, but they also created serious problems. Royal authority was essentially auctioned off to the highest bidders. Local administration became chaotic as newly purchased officials tried to recover their investments by exploiting their positions. More seriously, Richard's absence from England, he spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in the country, left the kingdom vulnerable to ambitious nobles and foreign enemies. The system of royal government that Henry II had created depended on active royal supervision. Without that supervision, it began to break down. But Richard's contemporary reputation was based on his military prowess, not his administrative skills. He was called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, because of his legendary courage in battle. His crusading exploits made him the most famous warrior king in Europe. The Third Crusade was launched in response to Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in 1187. This disaster had shocked the Christian world and prompted the greatest military effort since the First Crusade. 3 kings, Richard of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, all took the cross. Richard's crusading army was the most professional and best equipped force of its time. He had spent 2 years preparing for the expedition, gathering supplies, arranging transportation, and recruiting the finest knights and soldiers from throughout his domains. The English contingent travelled to the Holy Land by sea, stopping first in Sicily to winter, and gather additional supplies. Richard's stay in Sicily nearly derailed the entire crusade when he became involved in local politics, and ended up conquering the island from its Norman rulers. The conquest of Sicily demonstrated Richard's military genius, but also his political recklessness. He had diverted his entire army from its primary objective to pursue a completely unnecessary war. Only pressure from his fellow crusaders convinced him to continue toward the Holy Land. When Richard finally reached Palestine in 1191, he immediately proved his worth as a military commander. He captured the crucial port city of Acre after a siege that had lasted nearly 2 years. His victory was achieved through superior siege engines, better logistics, and more disciplined troops. But the capture of Acre also revealed Richard's capacity for brutality. When Saladin failed to meet the terms of Acre's surrender quickly enough, Richard ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners. This massacre shocked both Christians and Muslims and made any negotiated settlement more difficult. Richard's greatest military achievement was his victory at the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191. Saladin's army had been harassing the crusading forces during their march south from Acre. Richard organised a fighting retreat that drew the Muslim cavalry into a devastating counterattack by his heavy cavalry. The victory at Arsuf opened the road to Jerusalem and established Richard as the premier military commander of his generation. But it also marked the high point of his crusading career. Despite 2 more years of campaigning, Richard never achieved his ultimate goal of recapturing the Holy City. The problem wasn't military. Richard's forces could probably have taken Jerusalem by assault. The problem was strategic. Even if the Crusaders captured the city, they lacked the manpower to hold it permanently. Saladin controlled the surrounding countryside and could simply wait for the Christian army to exhaust itself. Richard's political situation was also deteriorating. His alliance with Philip Augustus of France had collapsed amid mutual accusations of treachery. Philip had returned to Europe and was actively plotting against Richard's continental territories. The German emperor was holding Richard's nephew hostage and demanding ransom. Most seriously, Richard's brother John was stirring up rebellion in England. John claimed that Richard had died in the Holy Land and that he was the rightful heir to the throne. He allied with Philip Augustus and began seizing royal castles throughout England. These pressures finally forced Richard to negotiate with Saladin. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in 1192, established a 3-year truce that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem while acknowledging Muslim control over the city. It was a face-saving compromise that satisfied nobody completely. Richard began his journey home in October 1192, but his adventures were far from over. Travelling in disguise through Central Europe, he was recognised and captured by Leopold of Austria, whose banners Richard had torn down at Acre. Leopold handed Richard over to the German Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom. The king's captivity created a crisis in England that nearly destroyed the Angevin Empire. John openly claimed the throne and allied with Philip Augustus to invade Normandy. Royal government in England collapsed as nobles chose sides between John and the officials who remained loyal to the captive king. The crisis was resolved by Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s but still formidable. Released from prison after Henry II's death, Eleanor took charge of raising Richard's ransom and organising resistance to John's rebellion. Her political skill and reputation for ruthlessness held the kingdom together during its darkest hour. The ransom demanded for Richard was 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times England's annual royal revenue. Eleanor organised a systematic extraction of wealth from every possible source. Churches surrendered their gold and silver, Monasteries contributed their treasures. Even the poorest peasants were taxed to free their king. The enormous ransom was finally assembled and delivered to Germany in 1194. Richard was released and immediately returned to England to deal with John's rebellion. The brothers were reconciled, but the financial cost of the king's captivity had crippled English government for a generation. Richard spent the remaining 5 years of his reign trying to recover his continental territories from Philip Augustus. This warfare was less glamorous than crusading, but required the same military skills and enormous financial resources. The king was killed at the siege of Charlus Castle in Aquitaine on April 6, 1199. He was struck by a crossbow bolt while examining the castle's defences and died from the resulting infection. His last act was to forgive the crossbowman who had shot him, though his followers executed the man anyway. Richard's death ended the most romantic period of Plantagenet rule. He had been the perfect medieval knight, brave, generous, and devoted to military glory. But he had also nearly bankrupted his kingdom and neglected the administrative foundations of royal power. The succession passed to John, Richard's youngest brother. John was intelligent, energetic, and capable of brilliant political manoeuvres, but he was also suspicious, cruel, and prone to fits of rage that alienated potential supporters. Medieval chroniclers called him Lackland because he had inherited no territory from his father, but the nickname proved prophetic. John's reign began with a disputed succession that immediately weakened his position. Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's deceased brother Geoffrey, had a stronger legal claim to the throne under the principles of primogeniture. Arthur was supported by Philip Augustus of France and by many nobles in Anjou and Brittany. The succession war lasted from 1199 to 1202 and ended with John's apparent victory. Arthur was captured at the siege of Mirebeau and disappeared into John's custody. Most historians believe John murdered his nephew personally, though the exact circumstances remain unknown. Arthur's disappearance created a scandal that damaged John's reputation throughout Europe. Philip Augustus used the murder as justification for declaring John's French territories forfeit. The French king began systematic conquest of Normandy, Anjou, and most other Angevin possessions on the continent. John's response to this crisis was catastrophically ineffective. Instead of fighting for his inheritance, he spent crucial months pursuing a romantic obsession with Isabella of Angoulême. He married Isabella despite her engagement to another nobleman, creating additional enemies among the French nobility. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was a turning point in English history. The duchy had been connected to England since 1066, and most English noble families had estates on both sides of the Channel. The French conquest forced these families to choose between their English and Norman lands. Most chose England, but the loss of Normandy fundamentally changed the character of English nobility. They became a purely English aristocracy for the first time since the Norman conquest. This would have profound consequences for English political development. John's domestic policies were as disastrous as his foreign wars. He demanded unprecedented taxes to fund his unsuccessful attempts to recover his French territories. He seized church revenues and sold royal offices to raise money. He used royal justice to extort fines and punishments from his subjects. The king's treatment of the church created additional problems. John quarrelled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the Pope appointed Stephen Langton without John's consent, the king refused to allow Langton to enter England. The dispute escalated until Pope Innocent placed England under interdict in 1208. Church services were suspended throughout the kingdom. Marriages, funerals, and other sacraments were forbidden. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. This spiritual catastrophe horrified medieval people and turned popular opinion against the king. John's response was to confiscate all church property in England and use the revenues to fund his government. This provided enormous short-term income but created long-term political disaster. The English clergy became implacably hostile to royal authority. The crisis deepened in 1209 when Pope Innocent excommunicated John personally. This meant that any Christian could kill the king without committing sin. Philip Augustus of France began preparing another invasion of England, claiming to act as the Pope's champion against an excommunicated tyrant. John was finally forced to submit to papal authority in 1213. He accepted Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury and agreed to compensate the Church for its losses. Most humiliatingly, he surrendered England to the Pope and received it back as a papal fief, agreeing to pay annual tribute to Rome. This submission solved John's problems with the Church but created new difficulties with his nobles. English barons were outraged that their king had made England a vassal state of the papacy. They were equally angry about the crushing taxation that had been imposed to fund John's unsuccessful wars. The final straw was John's defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. This battle ended John's last attempt to recover his French territories and left him completely discredited as a military leader. The English barons decided that a king who had lost an empire and humiliated himself before the Pope was no longer worthy of their obedience. The Baronial Rebellion began in early 1215 and quickly gained momentum. The rebels demanded that John confirm the laws and customs that had been established by earlier kings. They wanted protection from arbitrary taxation, illegal imprisonment, and abuse of royal justice. John initially tried to resist, but his support crumbled rapidly. The rebels captured London and were joined by many nobles who had previously remained loyal. Even Stephen Langton, despite owing his position to papal support for the king, sided with the baronial demands. On June 15, 1215, John met the rebel barons at Runnymede, a meadow beside the Thames west of London. There he was forced to accept a document that would become one of the most important texts in the history of constitutional government, Magna Carta. Magna Carta established the principle that royal power was subject to legal limitations. The king could not impose taxes without the consent of his nobles. He could not imprison free men without due process of law. He had to respect the rights of the church and the privileges of towns. Most importantly, Magna Carta established that the law was supreme over the king himself. If the king violated the charter's provisions, a committee of barons had the right to rebel against him and seize his property until he made amends. But John had no intention of honouring his promises. As soon as he was free from immediate pressure, he appealed to Pope Innocent for support. The Pope, grateful for John's earlier submission, declared Magna Carta invalid and excommunicated the rebel barons. This papal intervention triggered the First Barons' War, a civil conflict that lasted from 1215 to 1217. The rebel barons, unable to defeat John's mercenary armies, invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne through his wife's connection to the English royal family. Louis landed in England in 1216 with a substantial French army and was proclaimed king by the rebel barons. For a moment it seemed that England might become a province of France, just as it had nearly become a Danish dependency under Knut 2 centuries earlier. But John's death on October 19, 1216, changed the entire situation. The king died of dysentery while campaigning against the rebels, leaving behind a 9-year-old son named Henry. The loyalist barons immediately proclaimed Henry III as king and offered to reissue Magna Carta with modifications. John's death also revealed the foreign character of Louis's cause. English barons who had supported a French prince against a hated English king were less enthusiastic about accepting permanent French rule. Many began switching sides to support the child king Henry III. The war was finally ended by William Marshal, the greatest knight of his generation and now regent for the young king. Marshal defeated Louis's forces at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217 and forced the French prince to renounce his claim to the English throne. John's reign had been a disaster for the Plantagenet dynasty. He had lost the greater part of the Angevin Empire, humiliated the English crown before the Pope, and provoked a civil war that nearly led to French conquest. But his failures had also produced Magna Carta, which would become the foundation of English constitutional government. The reign of Henry III would determine whether the Plantagenet dynasty could recover from John's disasters and create a new form of English monarchy. Henry III was 9 years old when he became King of England. His father John had died in the midst of a civil war, with French armies occupying London and rebel barons controlling much of the kingdom. The future of Plantagenet rule, indeed of English independence, hung by the slenderest thread. The boy King's salvation came from an unexpected source: William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. Marshal was over 70 years old, but he was still the most respected knight in Europe. He had served 4 English kings faithfully and commanded universal admiration for his honour and military skill. Marshal accepted the regency for Henry III and immediately began the delicate task of reuniting the kingdom. His first step was to reissue Magna Carta in the young king's name, but with modifications that removed the most objectionable provisions from the royal perspective. This new version of Magna Carta satisfied most of the rebel barons while preserving essential royal prerogatives. It demonstrated that the new government was committed to lawful rule, while avoiding the humiliating constraints that John had been forced to accept. Marshal's military campaign against the French invaders was equally skillful. At the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, his forces defeated Prince Louis's army decisively. The French prince agreed to abandon his claim to the English throne and withdraw his forces from England. The naval battle of Dover later that year eliminated the French threat permanently. English ships commanded by Hubert de Burgh destroyed a French fleet carrying reinforcements to Louis. This victory secured the English Channel and prevented any renewal of the French invasion. By 1219, when William Marshal died, Henry III's throne was secure. England was united under royal authority, foreign enemies had been expelled, and the kingdom was at peace for the first time in over a decade. But the young king would face new challenges as he grew to maturity. Henry's minority government was dominated by Hubert de Burgh, who served as Chief Justiciar from 1219 to 1232. De Burgh was an experienced administrator who had learned statecraft under John and Richard III. He provided the stability and continuity that England needed during the king's youth. The Regency government's greatest achievement was establishing Magna Carta as a permanent part of English constitutional law. The charter was reissued again in 1225, this time with Henry's personal seal after he had reached majority. This final version became the definitive text that would influence English law for centuries. But Magna Carta was more than just a list of noble privileges. It established fundamental principles that would shape the development of English government. The rule of law was supreme over royal will. Taxation required consent from the governed. Individual rights were protected against arbitrary government action. These principles became embedded in English political culture during Henry's long reign. Every time the king needed extraordinary taxation, he had to summon assemblies of nobles and bishops to grant consent. These assemblies gradually evolved into Parliament, the institution that would ultimately limit royal power permanently. Henry III assumed personal rule in 1227, but his early years as an adult king were marked by political instability. He dismissed Hubert de Burgh and began relying on foreign advisers, particularly Peter de Roche, the Poitevin Bishop of Winchester. This policy of favouring foreign counsellors created resentment among English nobles who felt excluded from royal favour. The situation worsened when Henry married Eleanor of Provence in 1236 and began showering honours and estates on her Savoyard relatives. The king's financial problems added to the political tensions. Henry was extravagant by nature and generous to his favourites. He loved fine clothes, elaborate ceremonies, and ambitious building projects. His court was more magnificent than any since the conquest, but it was also ruinously expensive. Henry's artistic patronage was one of the glories of his reign. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style that was revolutionising European architecture. The new abbey was designed to rival the great cathedrals of France and to serve as a fitting shrine for Edward the Confessor, whom Henry regarded as his patron saint. The reconstruction of Westminster Abbey was part of a broader architectural renaissance that transformed England during Henry's reign. Gothic cathedrals rose at Salisbury, Lincoln, and Wells. Parish churches throughout the country were rebuilt in the new style. English masons and craftsmen achieved international recognition for their skill. But artistic achievement couldn't solve political problems. Henry's financial needs led him into the most disastrous foreign adventure of his reign, the Sicilian business. In 1254, Pope Innocent IV offered to make Henry's second son, Edmund, King of Sicily, if Henry would conquer the island from its current German rulers. Henry accepted this papal proposal without understanding its implications. Sicily was defended by professional soldiers and protected by a powerful navy. The conquest would require enormous military and financial resources that England simply didn't possess. More seriously, Henry promised to pay the Pope's existing debts from previous Sicilian campaigns. These debts totalled over 830,000 marks, more than twice England's annual royal revenue. The king had committed his kingdom to an impossible financial burden. When Henry demanded unprecedented taxation to fund the Sicilian adventure, the English nobles refused to cooperate. They pointed out that they had no interest in conquering Sicily and no obligation to pay for the king's foreign fantasies. The constitutional crisis that followed would transform English government forever. The leader of noble resistance was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. De Montfort was a French noble who had married Henry's sister Eleanor and had become one of the king's most trusted counsellors. But he was also a man of rigid principles who believed that royal power should be exercised for the common good rather than personal advantage. De Montfort and other reform-minded nobles presented Henry with a programme of governmental reform known as the Provisions of Oxford in 1258. These provisions would have placed royal administration under the control of a council of nobles and required parliamentary consent for all major policy decisions. Henry initially accepted the Provisions of Oxford because he desperately needed money and parliamentary support. But he soon began plotting to overthrow the constraints that had been placed on royal authority. He appealed to Pope Alexander IV, who declared the provisions invalid as an infringement on divinely ordained royal power. The king's repudiation of the reform programme triggered the Second Barons' War in 1264. This conflict was more serious than the rebellion against John because it raised fundamental questions about the nature of royal government and the rights of the governed. Simon de Montfort's forces defeated the king at the Battle of Lewes in May 1264. Henry and his eldest son Edward were captured and forced to accept a new reform programme that placed real limitations on royal power. For over a year, England was governed by a noble council that ruled in the king's name but ignored his wishes. The most revolutionary aspect of de Montfort's government was his decision to summon representatives from the towns and shires to Parliament. The Parliament of 1265 included not only nobles and bishops, but also 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from selected towns. This was the first time that the common people of England had been represented in a national assembly. De Montfort believed that governmental authority should rest on popular consent rather than just royal will or noble privilege. He was creating the foundations of democratic government 6 centuries before the American Revolution. But de Montfort's constitutional experiments were cut short by military defeat. Prince Edward escaped from captivity and rallied royalist forces throughout the kingdom. At the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, the royalist army surrounded and destroyed de Montfort's forces. De Montfort himself was killed, and his body mutilated by vengeful royalist soldiers. The defeat at Evesham ended the Second Barons' War, but it didn't solve the underlying problems that had caused the conflict. Henry III was restored to full royal authority, but he had learned that English nobles would resist arbitrary government and that he needed parliamentary support for major policy initiatives. Prince Edward, who had gained military and political experience during the Civil War, gradually took over the responsibilities of government as his father aged. Edward was a more effective military leader than his father, and a shrewder politician than his uncle Richard the Vire had been. The prince's greatest achievement was the conquest of Wales, which finally brought that Celtic region under direct English control. Welsh princes had maintained their independence for centuries by exploiting the mountainous terrain and playing English factions against each other. But Edward organised a systematic campaign that combined military pressure with political isolation. He built a network of castles throughout Wales and settled English colonists in strategic locations. Most importantly, he prevented Welsh princes from receiving foreign support by maintaining good relations with France and Scotland. The conquest of Wales was completed by 1284 with the capture and execution of Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the last independent Welsh prince. Edward's newborn son was proclaimed Prince of Wales, a title that English heirs to the throne have held ever since. The successful Welsh campaigns demonstrated the military and administrative innovations that would characterise Edward's later reign. Professional soldiers replaced feudal levies. Systematic taxation funded long-term military operations. Central government coordination replaced the improvised campaigns of earlier periods. Henry III died on November 16, 1272, at Westminster Palace. He had reigned for 56 years, longer than any previous English monarch. His reign had seen the establishment of Parliament, the development of Gothic architecture, and the creation of constitutional principles that would outlast the Plantagenet dynasty. But Henry had also left serious problems for his successor. Royal finances were chaotic, the nobility was fractious, and Scotland was beginning to challenge English claims to overlordship. Edward the Royal would spend his reign addressing these challenges and transforming England into the dominant power in the British Isles. The long reign of Henry III had been a period of constitutional experimentation and cultural achievement. England emerged from it with institutions and traditions that would shape its future development for centuries. But the kingdom still needed strong leadership to realise its full potential. Edward I was 33 years old when he inherited the English throne in 1272. He was already an experienced military commander and political leader, having effectively governed England during his father's final years. But Edward would transform the kingdom in ways that Henry III had never imagined possible. Edward's nickname, Longshanks, reflected his unusual height. He was over 6 feet tall at a time when most men were considerably shorter, but contemporaries also called him the Hammer of the Scots, because of his relentless campaigns to bring Scotland under English rule. His reign would be defined by warfare, conquest, and the systematic expansion of English authority. The new king's first major achievement was the creation of the Model Parliament in 1295. This assembly was called the Model Parliament by later historians because it established the pattern for all subsequent English parliaments. It included nobles, bishops, and representatives from the towns and shires, all three estates of medieval society. Edward's Parliament was more than just an expanded version of Henry III's assemblies. It was a sophisticated institution designed to involve the entire political community in governmental decisions. The king understood that major policy initiatives required broad support, and Parliament provided the mechanism for obtaining that support. The Model Parliament met to address the crisis created by Edward's simultaneous wars in Wales, Scotland, and France. These conflicts required unprecedented military and financial resources that could only be obtained through parliamentary taxation. The king needed to convince his subjects that these wars served the national interest. Edward's approach to parliamentary government was pragmatic rather than ideological. He didn't believe in limiting royal power, but he recognised that effective government required cooperation from the governed. Parliament became his tool for mobilising English resources for war and conquest. The parliamentary system that Edward created had lasting consequences for English constitutional development. It established the principle that major taxation required consent from representatives of the entire kingdom. It created procedures for petitioning the Crown and addressing grievances. Most importantly, it made Parliament an indispensable part of English government. But Edward's greatest military achievement was the conquest of Wales. The Welsh had maintained their independence for over 2 centuries after the Norman conquest by exploiting their mountainous terrain and political fragmentation among English rulers. Edward decided to end Welsh independence permanently. The Welsh Wars began in 1276 when Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, refused to pay homage to Edward as his overlord. Llywelyn had allied with Simon de Montfort during the Second Barons' War and continued to support English rebels against royal authority. Edward's response was methodical and overwhelming. He assembled the largest military force seen in Britain since the Norman conquest. Professional soldiers replaced feudal levies. Systematic logistics supported long-term campaigns. Most importantly, Edward coordinated land and sea operations to prevent Welsh forces from escaping royal armies. The First Welsh War ended in 1277 with Llywelyn's submission and the reduction of his territory to Snowdonia. But the settlement proved temporary. In 1282, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd launched a new rebellion that spread throughout Wales. Edward's response was even more decisive than before. He mobilised the entire resources of England for the conquest of Wales. Professional armies operated simultaneously from multiple directions. A new castle-building programme created permanent bases throughout conquered territory. The death of Llywelyn at Grufford in December 1282 effectively ended Welsh independence. Dafydd continued resistance for several more months, but he was captured and executed in 1283. Edward had achieved what no previous English king had accomplished, the complete conquest of Wales. The conquest of Wales was consolidated through one of the most impressive castle-building programmes in medieval history. Edward constructed a ring of massive stone fortresses around Snowdonia, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech and Beaumaris. These castles were designed by Master James of St. George, the greatest military engineer of his time. Edward's Welsh castles were more than military strongholds. They were symbols of English authority and centres of colonial administration. English settlers were brought in to populate new towns built beside the castles. Welsh law was replaced by English law. The Welsh language was marginalised in favour of English. The political settlement imposed on Wales became the model for English colonialism throughout the medieval period. Conquered territories were integrated into the English administrative system, while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. Native elites were replaced by English appointees, but local customs were generally respected. Edward's son, the future Edward II, was born at Caernarfon Castle in 1284 and was proclaimed Prince of Wales. This established the tradition that English heirs to the throne would bear this title, a tradition that continues today. The conquest of Wales was presented as bringing Celtic peoples into the English royal family rather than destroying their independence. But Edward's ambitions extended beyond Wales. He also claimed to be the overlord of Scotland, and Scottish resistance to this claim would dominate the final decades of his reign. The Scottish succession crisis began in 1286 with the death of King Alexander III, who left only his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as his heir. Margaret died in 1290 while travelling to Scotland, leaving multiple claimants to the Scottish throne. The two main contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the famous Robert the Bruce. Both had legitimate claims through descent from earlier Scottish kings. The Scottish nobles couldn't agree between them and invited Edward the Thorough to arbitrate the dispute. Edward accepted the role of arbitrator, but demanded that both claimants acknowledge him as overlord of Scotland before he would make his decision. This was the crucial moment when Scottish independence was placed at risk. Both Balliol and Bruce agreed to Edward's terms because they needed his support to win the throne. Edward decided in favour of John Balliol in 1292, but he treated Scotland as a vassal kingdom subject to English authority. Scottish legal decisions were appealed to English courts. Scottish military forces were required for English wars. Scottish nobles were summoned to attend Edward's parliament. This subordination of Scotland proved intolerable to Scottish national pride. When Edward demanded Scottish military service for his war in France in 1294, the Scottish nobles rebelled. They deposed John Balliol, formed an alliance with France, and began preparing for war with England. Edward's response was characteristically decisive. He marched north with a large army in 1296 and captured the Scottish fortress of Berwick after a brief siege. The sack of Berwick was followed by a massacre of civilians that shocked contemporaries and established Edward's reputation for ruthlessness. The Scottish army was destroyed at the Battle of Dunbar in April 1296. John Balliol was forced to abdicate and was taken prisoner to England. The Stone of Destiny, on which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was carried off to Westminster Abbey as a symbol of English conquest. For several years, Scotland seemed to have been conquered as completely as Wales. English administrators governed the kingdom. English garrisons held the major castles. Scottish resistance appeared to have been crushed permanently. But in 1297, a minor Scottish knight named William Wallace began a guerrilla campaign that would revive Scottish independence. Wallace's victory over an English army at Stirling Bridge demonstrated that Edward's conquest was far from secure. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was a tactical masterpiece that exploited English overconfidence. Wallace allowed half the English army to cross the narrow bridge before attacking. The English forces were trapped between the Scottish army and the river, and most were killed or drowned. Edward was forced to return to Scotland in person to restore English authority. His victory over Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298 seemed to end the Scottish rebellion, but Wallace escaped and continued guerrilla warfare for several more years. The capture and execution of William Wallace in 1305 appeared to mark the final triumph of English authority in Scotland. Wallace was tried for treason in Westminster Hall and executed with the full barbarities reserved for traitors, hanged, drawn, and quartered. But Scottish resistance was renewed in 1306 when Robert the Bruce had himself crowned King of Scotland at Scone Abbey. Bruce's rebellion was initially unsuccessful, and he was forced to flee to Ireland after several defeats. But he returned in 1307 to begin the campaign that would eventually restore Scottish independence. Edward thus died at Burgh by Sands on July 7, 1307, while marching north to suppress Bruce's rebellion. His final orders were that his body should not be buried until Scotland had been completely conquered. His son Edward II inherited both the throne and an unfinished war that would haunt his entire reign. Beyond his military campaigns, Edward the Valm was also a great legal reformer who systematized English law in ways that had lasting influence. His reign saw the passage of numerous statutes that codified legal procedures and established precedents for future legislation. The Statute of Westminster vs. 1275 reformed court procedures and expanded royal justice. The Statute of Mortmain, 1279, restricted the transfer of land to religious institutions. The Statute of Winchester, 1285, reorganized local law enforcement. These and other statutes created the framework for English common law that survived until modern times. Edward's administrative innovations were equally important. He created new governmental departments that specialized in different aspects of royal business. The Chancery handled correspondence and legal documents. The Exchequer managed royal finances. The Wardrobe organized military campaigns and household expenses. These bureaucratic developments made English government more efficient and professional than any other European kingdom. Administrative records from Edward's reign provide detailed information about medieval government that is available nowhere else. The English state was becoming a sophisticated institution that could survive changes of ruler and maintain consistent policies across generations. Edward's reign also saw significant economic and social changes. The conquest of Wales and the attempted conquest of Scotland required enormous financial resources that had to be extracted from English society. New forms of taxation were developed that reached deeper into the population than ever before. The growth of royal taxation had important constitutional consequences. Edward needed parliamentary consent for his extraordinary financial demands, which strengthened Parliament's role in government. But taxation also stimulated economic development by forcing people to earn money rather than relying on subsistence agriculture. Urban growth accelerated during Edward's reign as towns became centres for collecting and spending royal revenues. London emerged as one of Europe's largest cities. Provincial towns like York, Bristol and Norwich expanded rapidly. A money economy gradually replaced the barter systems that had dominated rural areas. The expansion of trade and commerce created new social classes that would play important roles in later English history. Merchants and craftsmen accumulated wealth and political influence. Professional administrators served the crown and great nobles. Lawyers developed expertise in the increasingly complex legal system. But Edward's reign also saw troubling developments that would have serious consequences for his successors. His expensive wars had severely strained royal finances. His authoritarian methods had created resentment among nobles and commons alike. Most seriously, his failure to conquer Scotland had left England with a hostile northern neighbour. The expulsion of the Jews in 1290 was one of Edward's most controversial acts. England had maintained a substantial Jewish population since the Norman conquest, and Jewish moneylenders had provided essential financial services. But growing anti-Semitism and the king's financial needs led to systematic persecution. Edward confiscated Jewish property before expelling the entire community from England. This provided short-term financial relief, but eliminated a vital source of credit for the English economy. England wouldn't have a significant Jewish population again until the 17th century. When Edward thus died in 1307, he left England as the dominant power in the British Isles, but with serious unresolved problems. Scotland remained unconquered despite decades of warfare. Royal finances were severely strained by military expenses. The nobility was restless under authoritarian royal government. Edward II would inherit these problems along with the throne, but he lacked his father's military and political skills. The next reign would demonstrate how quickly Plantagenet achievements could be undermined by weak leadership and political miscalculation. The long Plantagenet experiment in English kingship was approaching a crisis that would test whether medieval monarchy could adapt to changing social and political conditions. The foundations that Edward after had laid were strong, but they would need equally strong leadership to survive the challenges ahead. Edward II inherited his father's throne in 1307, but he did not inherit his father's abilities. Where Edward the Varm had been a warrior king who commanded respect through military success, Edward II was more interested in music, poetry, and the companionship of handsome young men than in the business of kingship. The new king's first major crisis came from his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight who had been Edward's companion since childhood. Edward I had banished Gaveston in 1307, recognising the dangerous influence he had over his son. But one of Edward II's first acts as king was to recall his favourite and shower him with honours. Gaveston was made Earl of Cornwall and given vast estates throughout England. More shocking to contemporary nobles, he was granted unprecedented access to royal authority. He acted as regent when Edward was absent from England. He controlled appointments to royal offices. He effectively ruled England in the king's name. The English nobility was outraged by Gaveston's elevation. He was a foreigner with no legitimate claim to authority. His arrogant behaviour toward established English lords created deep resentment. Most seriously, his influence over the king seemed to prevent Edward from fulfilling his royal duties. The crisis deepened when Edward's military campaigns in Scotland proved disastrous. Robert the Bruce had renewed Scottish resistance after Edward III's death, and the new English king seemed incapable of effective response. The humiliating defeat at Loudon Hill in 1307 was followed by a series of Scottish victories that undid decades of English conquest. By 1310, the English nobles had organised formal opposition to the king's government. They demanded that Edward accept a committee of Lords Ordainers who would reform royal administration and eliminate corrupt influences. Most importantly, they insisted that Piers Gaveston be banished from England permanently. Edward initially accepted the ordinances of 1311, but he had no intention of honouring his promises. He secretly recalled Gaveston and began plotting to overthrow the constraints that had been placed on his authority. This duplicity triggered a civil war that would last for over a decade. The conflict reached its climax in 1312 when a group of nobles led by the Earl of Warwick captured and executed Piers Gaveston. The execution was carried out despite Edward's promises of safe conduct, and it created a blood feud between the king and his leading nobles. But Edward's greatest humiliation was still to come. In 1314 he led a massive English army north to relieve the siege of Stirling Castle, the last English stronghold in Scotland. The Scots under Robert the Bruce met this invasion at Bannockburn, just south of Stirling. The Battle of Bannockburn was one of the greatest military disasters in English history. Edward's army outnumbered the Scots by at least 2-1 and included the finest knights in England. But Scottish tactics, superior leadership, and English overconfidence combined to produce a devastating defeat. The English army was routed completely. Hundreds of nobles were killed or captured. Edward himself barely escaped, fleeing ignominiously to Dunbar Castle, while his army disintegrated behind him. Scottish independence was secured permanently, and English prestige suffered a blow from which Edward II would never recover. The disaster at Bannockburn destroyed what remained of Edward's authority. English nobles who had reluctantly supported the king now openly despised him. The royal treasury was empty. Scottish raids devastated northern England while the king seemed paralysed by his own incompetence. Into this power vacuum stepped Edward's queen, Isabella of France. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, and had been married to Edward in 1308 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But she had grown to despise her husband's weakness and his neglect of her in favour of male favourites. Isabella's opportunity came in 1325 when Edward sent her to negotiate with her brother, the French king, about disputes over English territories in France. Instead of returning to England, Isabella began an affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble who had escaped from the Tower of London. Isabella and Mortimer's relationship scandalised Europe, but it also created a formidable political partnership. Isabella brought legitimacy as the Queen of England and the daughter of the French king. Mortimer provided military expertise and connections with Edward's enemies among the English nobility. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army provided by Isabella's brother. They landed in Suffolk and marched toward London, gathering supporters as they advanced. Edward's government collapsed without significant resistance. The king fled toward Wales with his latest favourite, Hugh Despencer the Younger, but they were captured near the Welsh border. Edward was forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle and died there in September 1327, almost certainly murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders. Isabella's coup was successful, but her regency for the young Edward III proved deeply unpopular. She and Mortimer governed England as virtual dictators, enriching themselves at public expense while neglecting the kingdom's real needs. Scottish raids continued to devastate northern England while the Regency government seemed interested only in personal profit. Edward III began asserting his independence from his mother and Mortimer as soon as he reached maturity. In 1330, at age 18, he organised a surprise attack that captured Mortimer at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was executed immediately, while Isabella was confined to comfortable but permanent exile. Edward III's personal rule began a new golden age of English monarchy that would last for 50 years. The young king possessed all the qualities his father had lacked: military skill, political judgment, and the ability to inspire loyalty among his nobles. Edward's first success was in Scotland, where he installed Edward Balliol as a puppet king in opposition to the Bruce dynasty. Although this intervention ultimately failed to restore English control over Scotland, it rebuilt English military confidence and demonstrated that the new king was a formidable opponent. But Edward's greatest achievement was the renewal of war with France that became known as the 100 Years' War. This conflict began in 1337 when Edward claimed the French throne through his mother's lineage, arguing that his descent from Philip V gave him better title than Philip VI. The English claim to the French throne was legally dubious but politically useful. It provided justification for a war that was actually about controlling English territories in France that the French kings were trying to absorb. More importantly, it gave English nobles a chance to win glory and profit through foreign conquest. Edward III's military campaigns in France were spectacularly successful, at least initially. The English victory at Sluys in 1340 gave England control of the English Channel. The triumph at Crécy in 1346 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of English longbowmen against French knights. The siege of Calais that followed Crécy lasted for 11 months and ended with the complete surrender of France's most important northern port. Calais became an English possession that would remain under English control for over 2 centuries, serving as both a military base and a commercial centre. Edward's son, known as the Black Prince, won even greater glory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This victory was so complete that the French king himself was captured and brought prisoner to London. French resistance collapsed, and Edward seemed poised to make his claim to the French throne a reality. But the English successes in France were overshadowed by a catastrophe that struck all of Europe in 1348, the arrival of the Black Death. The Black Death was a plague pandemic that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. It reached England in the summer of 1348 and spread rapidly throughout the country. No previous disaster in English history had caused such massive loss of life. The plague struck all levels of society, but it was particularly devastating to the poor who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Entire villages were abandoned. Monasteries lost most of their monks. Skilled craftsmen died faster than they could be replaced. The demographic catastrophe caused by the Black Death had profound economic and social consequences. The sudden shortage of labour gave surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power. Wages rose dramatically as employers competed for scarce workers. Traditional feudal obligations became impossible to enforce. The English government tried to prevent these social changes through legislation. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit workers from moving freely in search of better employment. But economic forces proved stronger than royal legislation. Rural society was transformed as peasants abandoned their traditional holdings to seek wage labour in areas where they could earn more money. The manorial system that had dominated English agriculture since the Norman conquest began to collapse as lords found it impossible to maintain traditional forms of labour service. These social changes created tensions that would explode into open revolt during the later years of Edward III's reign. But the immediate effect of the plague was to provide England with additional resources for the French war, as labour shortages drove up productivity and created new forms of wealth. Edward III's later campaigns in France were less successful than his early victories, but they maintained English dominance over much of southwestern France. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 gave England control over vast territories, in return for Edward renouncing his claim to the French throne. But the treaty proved temporary. Fighting resumed in the 1370s as French forces gradually reconquered most of the English territories. By the time Edward III died in 1377, English holdings in France had been reduced to small areas around Calais and Bordeaux. Edward III's death brought his grandson Richard II to the throne. Richard was only 10 years old, which created another regency crisis at a time when England faced serious internal and external challenges. The French war was going badly, royal finances were strained, and social tensions were approaching a breaking point. The regency for Richard II was dominated by his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. These men were experienced in warfare and politics, but they lacked the charisma and political skill that had made Edward III successful. More seriously, their policies alienated both the nobility and the common people. The crisis exploded in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, the largest popular uprising in English history. The immediate cause was a poll tax that demanded payment from every person over 15 years old, regardless of their ability to pay. This tax fell most heavily on the poorest members of society, who were already struggling with economic and social changes caused by the plague. The revolt began in Kent and Essex when tax collectors tried to enforce payment of the poll tax. Local communities drove out the collectors and began marching on London. The movement quickly spread throughout southeastern England and attracted support from urban workers as well as rural peasants. The rebels were led by Wat Tyler, a craftsman from Kent who proved to be a skilled military commander. Tyler's forces captured Canterbury, Rochester, and other major towns before converging on London. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents, and the punishment of corrupt officials. On June 14, 1381, the rebels entered London and began destroying the property of unpopular nobles and officials. They burned John of Gaunt's palace, killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and forced the young king to meet with them at Mile End. Richard II, despite being only 14 years old, showed remarkable courage during these negotiations. He promised to grant the rebels' main demands, including the abolition of serfdom and the pardoning of all participants in the revolt. Most of the rebels accepted these promises and began returning to their homes, but Wat Tyler and a group of more radical rebels demanded additional concessions, including the redistribution of church property and the execution of all royal officials. When Tyler met with the king again at Smithfield, a fight broke out and Tyler was killed by the Mayor of London. With their leader dead, the remaining rebels dispersed rapidly. Richard II immediately revoked all his promises, claiming that they had been made under duress. The revolt was suppressed with considerable violence, and many of its participants were executed. But the peasants' revolt had lasting consequences for English society. It demonstrated that the common people could organise effective resistance to government policies they considered unjust. It also showed that traditional forms of social control were breaking down under the pressure of economic change. Richard II's personal rule, which began in earnest after the suppression of the revolt, was marked by increasing authoritarianism and political instability. The king was intelligent and cultured, but he was also vain, suspicious, and prone to violent fits of temper. Richard's court became a centre for artistic and literary achievement. Geoffrey Chaucer served the king and wrote his greatest works during this period. Architecture and manuscript illumination flourished under royal patronage. But this cultural renaissance was overshadowed by political conflict. The king's greatest enemy was his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, who led a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant. These men believed that Richard was governing badly and needed to be controlled by aristocratic council. In 1387, they defeated a royalist army at Radcut Bridge and effectively took control of the kingdom. For 1 year, from 1387 to 1388, the Lords Appellant governed England in Richard's name. They purged the royal household, executed several of the king's favourites, and attempted to reform royal administration. But their rule was too harsh to maintain popular support, and Richard gradually regained his authority. The conflict between Richard II and his nobles was also influenced by religious developments that were undermining traditional authority. John Wycliffe, a theologian at Oxford University, had developed radical critiques of church corruption and papal authority. Wycliffe's followers, known as Lollards, argued that the Bible should be translated into English so that ordinary people could read God's word for themselves. They criticised the wealth of the church hierarchy and questioned the need for priests to mediate between God and humanity. These ideas were potentially revolutionary because they challenged not just religious authority but political authority as well. If ordinary people could interpret the Bible for themselves, why couldn't they also judge their political rulers? The Lollard movement became associated with social radicalism and political dissent. Richard II's final crisis came in the 1390s, when he began ruling as an absolute monarch who acknowledged no limits on his authority. He created a personal bodyguard of archers, imposed forced loans on his subjects, and used intimidation to control Parliament. The breaking point came in 1397 when Richard ordered the arrest of Thomas of Woodstock and other former Lords Appellant. Woodstock died in custody, probably murdered on the king's orders. This act of tyranny finally convinced the nobility that Richard had to be removed from the throne. The leader of the opposition was Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, who was John of Gaunt's son and Richard's cousin. Henry had been exiled by Richard in 1398, but he returned to England in 1399 while the king was campaigning in Ireland. Henry's return triggered the collapse of Richard's government with surprising speed. English nobles who had grown tired of the king's tyranny flocked to Henry's banner. Richard returned from Ireland to find his kingdom lost and his supporters scattered. Richard II was forced to abdicate in September 1399 and died in custody early in 1400, almost certainly murdered on Henry's orders. The House of Plantagenet, which had ruled England since 1154, was replaced by the House of Lancaster, but Henry IV's usurpation created new problems that would plague England for the next century. His claim to the throne was based on conquest rather than legitimate inheritance, and this weakness would eventually lead to the Wars of the Roses. The 14th century had seen England transformed by warfare, plague, and social revolution. The kingdom that emerged from these crises was different from the one that had existed under the early Plantagenets. Parliament was more powerful, the common people were more assertive, and traditional forms of authority were under constant challenge. Henry IV became King of England in 1399, but his title was tainted from the beginning. He had deposed and murdered his cousin, the anointed King Richard II. No amount of parliamentary approval could entirely legitimize what was essentially a successful rebellion against divinely ordained monarchy. Henry's claim to the throne was based on his descent from Edward III through John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. But there were other descendants of Edward III with arguably better claims. Most importantly, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, was descended from Edward's second son, while Henry was descended from the third son. These legitimacy questions would haunt the House of Lancaster for over 60 years. Every time royal government faced a crisis, alternative claimants would emerge to challenge Lancastrian rule. The problem would ultimately destroy the dynasty and plunge England into civil war. Henry's early reign was marked by constant rebellions and military campaigns. The Welsh, led by Owain Glyndwr, launched a major revolt that lasted from 1400 to 1415. Scottish raids continued to devastate northern England. Most seriously, powerful English nobles like the Percy family of Northumberland actively supported alternative claimants to the throne. The Percy Rebellion of 1403 nearly ended Henry's reign before it was properly established. Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, allied with Welsh and Scottish enemies to challenge Lancastrian rule. The rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Shrewsbury, where Hotspur was killed, but it demonstrated the fragility of Henry's position. Henry VI's reign was also marked by financial crisis and parliamentary conflict. The constant warfare required enormous expenditure, but Parliament was reluctant to grant the taxes needed to fund royal armies. The House of Commons began demanding oversight of royal finances and greater control over government policy. These parliamentary pressures established important precedents for limiting royal authority. The king could no longer govern effectively without regular parliamentary support. MPs began to see themselves as representatives of the nation, rather than just advisors to the crown. But Henry's greatest achievement was surviving long enough to pass the throne to his son. When Henry IV died in 1413, Henry V inherited a kingdom that was still troubled but no longer in immediate danger of collapse. Henry V was everything his father was not. Where Henry IV had been cautious and defensive, Henry V was bold and aggressive. Where the father had struggled to maintain his authority, the son commanded immediate respect and loyalty. The new king's solution to his dynasty's legitimacy problems was brilliant in its simplicity. He would win such glorious military victories that no one would question his right to rule. The renewal of war with France would unite the English nobility behind Lancastrian leadership and provide opportunities for glory and profit. Henry's invasion of France in 1415 was carefully planned and superbly executed. He landed in Normandy with about 11,000 men and immediately began the siege of Harfleur, an important port that controlled access to the Seine River. The siege of Harfleur lasted longer than expected and cost Henry about half his army through battle casualties and disease. When the port finally surrendered, the king faced a difficult decision: return to England with a minor victory or march across Normandy to demonstrate English strength. Henry chose the bold course and began a march toward Calais that became one of the most famous campaigns in English history. His small army, weakened by disease and short of supplies, had to cross territory held by a French army that outnumbered them by at least 3-1. The two armies met at Agincourt on October 25, 1415. The French position seemed overwhelming. They had more men, better equipment, and the advantage of fighting on their own soil. But Henry's tactical genius and the skill of English longbowmen produced one of the most famous victories in military history. The Battle of Agincourt was won primarily by English archers who decimated the French cavalry charges before they could reach the English lines. When the French knights finally closed with Henry's infantry, they found themselves fighting on foot in thick mud against fresh English soldiers. The slaughter was enormous. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured, including many of the greatest names in French chivalry. English losses were minimal, probably fewer than 100 men. The victory established Henry V as the greatest military commander of his generation. But Agincourt was just the beginning of Henry's French conquests. Between 1417 and 1419, he systematically conquered Normandy through careful siege warfare and diplomatic negotiation. French resistance collapsed as city after city opened its gates to English armies. Henry's greatest triumph was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which made him heir to the French throne. The French king Charles VI agreed to disinherit his own son in favour of Henry, who married Charles's daughter Catherine to seal the agreement. For a moment it seemed that Henry V had achieved what no English king since the Norman conquest had managed: the unification of England and France under a single crown. The dual monarchy created by the Treaty of Troyes would have fundamentally altered European history. But Henry's triumph was brief. He died of dysentery at the Siege of Meaux in 1422, just 2 years after signing the Treaty of Troyes. His death at age 35 left his infant son Henry VI as heir to both England and France. The regency for Henry VI was initially successful in maintaining English conquests in France. John, Duke of Bedford, governed northern France with skill and determination. But the emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 began the French revival that would ultimately drive the English from all their continental territories except Calais. Joan of Arc's military successes were less important than her psychological impact. She convinced the French that God supported their cause and that English rule was illegitimate. The coronation of the Dauphin Charles as Charles VII at Reims in 1427 provided France with an alternative focus of loyalty. Henry VI's personal rule began in the 1430s, and it quickly became clear that he had inherited none of his father's abilities. Henry was pious, gentle, and well-meaning, but he was also weak, indecisive, and possibly mentally ill. He was completely unsuited for the demands of medieval kingship. The young king's inadequacies became apparent as English fortunes in France declined rapidly. French armies reconquered Normandy and Gascony with minimal English resistance. By 1453, only Calais remained under English control, and the 100 Years' War was effectively over. The loss of France was a catastrophic blow to English prestige and morale. Thousands of English soldiers and settlers were forced to flee their homes. The profits from French territories that had sustained English government for decades disappeared overnight. More seriously, the end of the French war eliminated the external focus that had united English nobility behind Lancastrian rule. Without foreign enemies to fight, English nobles began to pursue their own interests and revive old quarrels with each other. Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 was intended to bring peace with France, but actually created additional problems. Margaret was beautiful, intelligent, and determined, but she was also French at a time when anything French was deeply unpopular in England. Margaret of Anjou quickly became the effective ruler of England as her husband retreated into religious devotion and periods of mental illness. She was a formidable political operator who understood that Lancastrian survival depended on eliminating potential rivals to her son's inheritance. But Margaret's aggressive methods created as many enemies as they eliminated. Her favouritism toward court nobles alienated the broader aristocracy. Her French birth made her suspect to popular opinion. Most importantly, her reliance on force rather than persuasion violated English expectations about royal government. The Lancastrian monarchy's greatest enemy was Richard, Duke of York, whose claim to the throne was actually superior to Henry VI, under the principles of primogeniture. Richard was descended from Edward III through both his father and mother, and his ancestors had ruled England before the Lancastrian usurpation. The Duke of York was also one of England's greatest landowners and most experienced military commanders. He had governed Ireland successfully and had led English forces in France with distinction. His combination of royal blood, political skill, and military reputation made him a natural focus for opposition to Lancastrian rule. The crisis came to a head in 1453 when Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown that left him unable to recognise even his wife and newborn son. Margaret of Anjou tried to maintain her authority, but Parliament appointed Richard of York as protector of the realm. York's protectorship was initially successful in restoring order and solvency to royal government, but when Henry VI recovered his sanity in 1454, Margaret immediately moved to remove York from power and eliminate him as a threat to her son's succession. This confrontation triggered the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil conflicts that lasted from 1455 to 1487. The wars were fought between the House of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolised by the white rose, for control of the English throne. The First Battle of St Albans in 1455 was won by Yorkist forces, and Henry the Rick was captured along with several leading Lancastrian nobles. But this victory didn't settle the succession question. It only demonstrated that armed force would be needed to resolve the dynasty crisis. The early phase of the wars was characterised by brief campaigns followed by periods of uneasy peace. Neither side could achieve decisive victory, and both royal authority and effective government gradually broke down as nobles built private armies and pursued personal feuds. The turning point came in 1460 when Richard of York openly claimed the English throne rather than just seeking to reform Henry VI's government. This escalation made compromise impossible and committed both sides to fight until one dynasty was completely destroyed. Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, but his claim passed to his son Edward. The young Duke of York proved to be as gifted a military commander as his father had been a politician. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, Edward's forces inflicted the bloodiest defeat in English history on the Lancastrian army. Edward IV's victory at Towton made him King of England and drove Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou into exile. For the first time since 1399, the House of Lancaster had lost control of the English throne, but Edward's reign was troubled by the same legitimacy questions that had plagued the Lancastrians. His title was based on military conquest rather than undisputed inheritance. More seriously, his policies alienated many of the nobles who had supported his rise to power. The greatest threat to Edward's rule came from his own supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Known as the Kingmaker, Warwick had been instrumental in Edward's victory, but felt inadequately rewarded for his services. His opposition to Edward's foreign policy and marriage choices led to open rebellion in 1469. Warwick's rebellion was initially successful. He captured Edward IV and briefly restored Henry VI to the throne in 1470. But Edward escaped from custody and returned with Burgundian support to reclaim his kingdom. The final phase of Edward VI's reign was marked by military success and administrative competence. Edward defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Margaret of Anjou and her son were crushed at the Battle of Tewkesbury the same year. Henry VI died in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. With the Lancastrian royal family extinct, Edward IV seemed to have secured his dynasty's hold on the throne. His reign from 1471 to 1483 was the most peaceful and prosperous period England had experienced since Henry V's death. But Edward's sudden death in 1483 created another succession crisis. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old and would require a regency. The power struggle that followed would destroy the House of York as completely as it had destroyed the House of Lancaster. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was Edward IV's youngest brother and had served him loyally throughout his reign. As the young Edward VI's uncle, Richard had a strong claim to serve as regent. But the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, were determined to maintain their own influence over royal government. Richard's response was swift and decisive. He arrested the leading Woodvilles, took custody of Edward III and his younger brother, and had himself proclaimed king as Richard III. The two young princes were imprisoned in the Tower of London and disappeared from history, almost certainly murdered on their uncle's orders. Richard III's usurpation was initially successful, but it fatally undermined the legitimacy that the House of York had built since 1461. If Richard could murder his own nephews and steal the crown, what prevented others from doing the same to him? The answer came from an unexpected source: Henry Tudor, whose claim to the throne was so weak that he had been ignored during the main phase of the Wars of the Roses. Henry was descended from Edward III through his mother's illegitimate line, but his real strength came from his promise to unite the warring dynasties. Henry Tudor invaded England in 1485 with a small army of French and Welsh supporters. Richard III marched to meet this challenge with superior forces, but his army was riddled with nobles who were prepared to change sides at the crucial moment. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, ended the Wars of the Roses and the Plantagenet dynasty simultaneously. Richard III was killed in the fighting, and Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield as Henry VII. Henry's victory was confirmed by his marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward I's daughter, which symbolically united the houses of Lancaster and York. The red and white roses were combined into the Tudor rose, representing the end of dynastic conflict. The Wars of the Roses had devastated England's medieval nobility and discredited the institution of feudal monarchy, but they had also created the conditions for a new form of royal government that would make England one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The long story of medieval England was ending. The Tudor dynasty that emerged from the ashes of civil war would create a different kind of kingdom, more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more connected to the wider world than anything the medieval period had produced. When the last Plantagenet king died at Bosworth Field, he took with him 1,000 years of medieval English history. The age of knights and castles, of feudalism and chivalry, of crusades and papal supremacy was drawing to a close. The modern world was about to begin. As we reach the end of this 1,000-year journey, the echoes of medieval England still resonate through the modern world. The institutions forged in those distant centuries, Parliament arising from royal councils, common law emerging from Henry II's reforms, constitutional monarchy born from the struggle between kings and nobles, these became the foundations upon which democratic government would rise. The language itself tells this story of transformation. Anglo-Saxon tongues that welcomed Germanic settlers, Norman French that dominated royal courts, the gradual fusion into Middle English that gave us Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and would eventually become the global language of our time. Every word we speak carries traces of this medieval evolution. The cultural achievements endure in stone and story. Gothic cathedrals still soar above English towns, their spires reaching toward heaven as they did 7 centuries ago. Medieval art and literature established traditions of creativity that would bloom into Shakespeare and beyond. The social structures that emerged from feudalism, the relationship between land and power, the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility, shaped the class system and democratic ideals that define English-speaking societies worldwide. Most remarkably, this transformation occurred on the same stage where we live today. The same Thames that carried Viking longships now flows through London. The same fields where medieval peasants toiled still feed modern communities. The same stones that witnessed Norman conquest support parish churches where people still gather. Medieval England didn't disappear. It became the foundation for everything that followed. In Parliament and law courts, in language and literature, in the very idea that power must serve the people rather than rule them, the medieval world lives on. The story continues, but it began here, in the mists of time when Saxon warriors first carved kingdoms from Roman ruins, and it echoes still in every democratic principle we hold dear.